San Antonio sells itself on the Alamo and the Riverwalk. Underneath that, prosecutors found something else. A heroin baron who took hostages inside Huntsville prison. A general who ordered 5 people shot inside a house on West French Place. 400 pounds of meth hidden in boxes of lettuce, bound for the streets of the most militarized city in America. This is San Antonio's most notorious gangsters. Section 1. The Señor of the Border. On a July afternoon in 1973, a police unit rolled through a stretch of San Antonio quiet enough that most residents on the block never learned what happened until they read about it in the paper the next morning. A man walked out of a building, was recognized, and within seconds was on the ground with 4 bullets in him. He survived. He would not be so lucky the following summer. Between those 2 moments sat the short, violent career of a man who prosecutors and journalists alike would come to call the most powerful heroin trafficker on the Texas-Mexico border, a man whose empire, according to court records and later reporting, reached from Guadalajara to San Diego to Chicago. His name was Federico Gomez Carrasco, and although he ran his operation out of Nuevo Laredo, he was born and raised in San Antonio, and it was San Antonio that would remember him longest. Carrasco went by many names in the press of the era. Some called him El Señor, others simply called him Freddy. He was described by those who saw him as an unremarkable-looking man, slightly overweight, a little taller than average, the kind of face that would not stand out in a crowded restaurant. That ordinariness was, in its own way, useful to him. A trafficker who does not look like a trafficker moves more easily through customs checkpoints, hotel lobbies, and the small border town societies where everybody notices everybody. By the late 1960s, Carrasco had built a heroin and cocaine distribution network large enough that Texas newspapers were calling him the biggest and deadliest drug lord on the border, a title that meant something in an era when the border trade was already producing its share of violent men. What separated Carrasco from the pack was reach. His network was not confined to South Texas. Product moved north through Chicago and west through San Diego, following the same interstate corridors that carried everything else in and out of the country, hidden among legitimate cargo, protected by an organization willing to kill anyone who threatened it. The mechanics of that protection ran through men whose names rarely made the front page but who did the work that kept Carrasco insulated from the risk closest to the street. One of them was Pete Guzman, a longtime member of the organization who had risen, by most accounts, to the rank of number 3, behind only Carrasco and one other lieutenant. Guzman earned that position the way men earn position in organizations like this one, not through paperwork or seniority, but through willingness. He was, in the language of the era, the man with the readiest trigger finger in the group, and San Antonio police came to believe he had killed a mule named Tony de la Garza on Carrasco's order, along with 2 other lower-ranking men in the organization. The killing of a mule inside your own supply chain is not incidental violence. It is a message sent downward through the ranks, a way of telling every courier and every street-level dealer that mistakes, real or suspected, carry a fixed and known price. Distance protects the man at the top of an organization like this. Carrasco did not need to be in the room when De la Garza died. He needed only to be believed capable of ordering it, and that belief did more to keep his organization disciplined than any accountant's ledger ever could. Guzman's usefulness to Carrasco eventually became a liability of its own kind, and the mechanism of that liability says something about how these organizations tend to fracture from the inside before any police investigation reaches them. Guzman began to brag, in drinking company, that Carrasco was not his boss but his subordinate, that the real power in the organization sat with him. Whether or not that boast reflected any real shift in the balance of the operation, it was the kind of talk that men in Guzman's position rarely survive making twice. He appears to have sensed the danger himself, because not long after, he stole a passport and left San Antonio for San Luis Potosi, putting distance between himself and a man he had just publicly diminished. He did not stay quiet for long. In a fit of what one contemporary account called badly miscalculated machismo, Guzman shot a bartender in San Luis Potosi for tolerating the presence of a gay man in his establishment, a killing that had nothing to do with Carrasco's business and everything to do with Guzman's own volatility. It is worth pausing on this, because it illustrates something true of almost every organization covered across this list. The men who provide the muscle for a trafficking network are rarely stable enough to be predictable, and their private violence, unrelated to any drug transaction, often does more to expose an organization to law enforcement than the drug trade itself ever does. By the fall of that period, a Bexar County grand jury had begun looking seriously into the possibility that organized crime, in a structured, mafia-like form, had taken root in San Antonio and its border satellite, Nuevo Laredo. That investigation reached far enough to attract the attention of a sitting member of Congress, Representative Henry B. Gonzalez, who flew back from Washington to bring the weight of federal assistance to the local inquiry. Gonzalez told reporters at the time that a group of men in Nuevo Laredo believed they could organize something resembling a mafia structure on the border, and he intended to see that effort stopped before it matured. His intervention did not go unnoticed by the men it targeted. One of the Nuevo Laredo figures who had relocated out of San Antonio ahead of narcotics investigators reportedly returned to the city weeks later and, in the course of an evening of drinking, mentioned that he was in the market for a hitman capable of dealing with the congressman. A local reporter who heard the remark treated it as drunken bravado and let it go unpublished. San Antonio's other daily paper did not make the same judgment, and the story broke with enough force to draw national coverage. Whether or not the threat against Gonzalez was ever serious is beside the point. The fact that it could be believed that a congressman investigating the border trade could plausibly be a target tells you what kind of city San Antonio's law enforcement believed itself to be operating in during those years. Carrasco's own downfall did not come from a single dramatic betrayal, but from the accumulation of exposure that follows any trafficker operating at his scale for long enough. He moved across the border with a regularity that one San Antonio police report described, memorably, as looking like a taxpayer commuting to work, present in Nuevo Laredo one week and San Antonio the next, treating the international boundary as little more than a formality. That mobility eventually caught up with him. In July of 1973, police confronted him in San Antonio, and in the exchange that followed, he was shot 4 times and survived. He would later be charged with killing a police officer during that period, and was suspected, in the loose and often unprovable way these figures accumulate reputations, of having been responsible for or connected to as many as 47 deaths across his years running the organization. Those numbers should be read with some caution. A man operating at Carrasco's level accumulates blame the way a magnet accumulates iron filings, and separating what he actually ordered from what simply got attached to his name after the fact is not something the historical record allows with full confidence. What is not in question is that by the time he was finally taken into custody for good, Texas authorities considered him one of the most dangerous men they had ever prosecuted, and they sent him to the maximum security wing at what was then the Texas Department of Corrections Huntsville unit, believing the walls of a state penitentiary would be the end of his story. They were nearly wrong. From July 24th to August 3rd, 1974, Carrasco engineered an armed takeover inside the prison, taking hostages in an attempt to force his way out through negotiation, and, when that failed, through sheer force of will. The standoff ran 11 days, the longest siege in the history of the American prison system at that time, a fact that alone tells you something about the will of the man at its center. His own attorney, Ruben Montemayor, entered the building in an attempt to mediate a peaceful resolution, a role that speaks to how seriously the state took the possibility that this could end without further bloodshed. It did not end that way. On the 11th day, Carrasco engaged in a 10-minute gun battle with the law enforcement officers surrounding the wing, and rather than surrender, he took his own life. The siege closed the most public chapter of his career in the same register in which he had run his organization for years, on his own terms, with violence as the final language when every other option had been exhausted. There is a temptation, looking back at a figure like Carrasco, to reduce him to a single dramatic image, the 11-day standoff, the 4 bullets he survived a year earlier, the reputation for 47 deaths that followed him into the history books. But the more instructive part of his story, for understanding how San Antonio's underworld actually functioned in this period, sits in the quieter details. It sits in the way his organization depended on men like Pete Guzman to do the killing that kept the supply chain disciplined, and in the way that same discipline collapsed the moment Guzman's own instability became more dangerous to the organization than useful. It sits in the way a Bexar County grand jury investigation could escalate, almost accidentally, into a congressional intervention and a rumored assassination plot against a sitting member of Congress. And it sits, most of all, in that unremarkable police observation that Carrasco crossed the border like a man commuting to a job, because that is in fact what he was doing. The border was not an obstacle to his business. It was the terrain his business was built on, a line that separated one country's jurisdiction from another's, but did nothing to separate the market on either side. Every trafficking figure who came after him in this city, from the prison gangs that would form a decade later to the cartel-linked networks running through San Antonio today, would learn to exploit that same terrain. The simple fact that a border patrolled by two different governments is, for the man moving product across it, mostly just a line on a map. Carrasco died in 1974, but the vacuum his death created did not stay empty for long. Within a decade, a new kind of organization would emerge from inside the Texas prison system itself, born not on the street but behind the walls that were supposed to contain men exactly like him, and it would prove far more durable than any single trafficker, however powerful, could ever be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fred Carrasco's empire died with him in an 11-day siege, proving one man's organization was only ever as strong as the man himself. What came next in San Antonio was built to survive exactly that kind of ending. Section 2. President for Life. Inside the Huntsville prison complex in 1984, in the exact same facility where Fred Carrasco had staged his 11-day siege a decade earlier, a San Antonio native named Heriberto Huerta was already serving time when he began doing something Fred Carrasco had never managed to do. Carrasco had built an empire based on the reach and the violence of a single man. Huerta understood that the problem with that model was the man himself, that any organization whose power lived inside one person's body would die the moment that body was removed from the equation. What Huerta built instead was a structure, a formal, written, constitutionalized organization that could absorb the removal of any individual and continue operating, because it was not organized around any individual. He called it Mexicanemi, a name derived from Nahuatl, meaning free Mexicans, and he designated San Antonio as its permanent geographic capital. He appointed himself president for life. The organization he put in place, sometimes called the Texas Mexican Mafia or simply La M, would go on to become what the National Drug Intelligence Center identified as the most powerful and influential gang operating in South Texas. That is where it began, in a prison block, with one man and a piece of paper. The piece of paper matters. Huerta wrote the gang's constitution himself, in the early years of the organization, and the document has surfaced repeatedly in federal prosecutions across 3 decades. What prosecutors have noted, consistently and with a kind of grim appreciation, is that the Constitution's authors did the government's work for them. The opening declaration of purpose leaves no interpretive room. According to the Mexicanemi Constitution, as read into the record in multiple trials, the organization is a criminal organization, one that works in any criminal aspect or interest for the benefit and advancement of Mexicanemi, dealing in drugs, contract killing, large-scale robbery, gambling, weapons, and everything imaginable. An assistant Bexar County district attorney who prosecuted the gang across more than a decade described that paragraph in court as a very nice little paragraph, because it essentially functions as a written admission of a racketeering enterprise, the precise finding required to bring the full weight of a federal RICO prosecution down on the organization. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed to dismantle the Italian-American mob, had found a new and willing subject. The structure Huerta built mirrored the language of the military more than the language of a street gang. At the top sat the president and vice president, described in the Constitution as responsible for all that occurs within the Mexicanemi. Beneath them ran a formal chain of command: generals, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and soldiers, each level with defined obligations and defined consequences for failing to meet them. San Antonio itself was divided into 4 geographic quadrants, each with its own operational chain. A free world general sat above the street-level structure in each major city, translating the instructions of the imprisoned leadership into operational reality on the outside. This division between the prison side and the street side of the organization is not incidental to how it functioned. It is the core design feature, and understanding it explains almost everything about why the organization proved so difficult to permanently dismantle. The man giving the orders was already behind bars. He could not be further imprisoned for ordering a drug delivery or a door kick. The consequences that ordinarily threaten the principal in a criminal hierarchy, arrest, prosecution, the loss of freedom, had already been imposed. Huerta sat in a federal cell and gave instructions, and the organization moved on the outside in ways that were extraordinarily difficult to trace back to him directly. The vice presidency went to Benito Alonso, a San Antonio man whose connection to the city's criminal history stretched all the way back to the Fred Carrasco era. Alonso had already served 3 separate stints in prison before 1974, for theft, burglary, and heroin possession, and it was during the period between his 3rd release and his rearrest that he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Released on parole in March of 1974, Alonso had been recruited into Carrasco's network on the streets of San Antonio. Through a series of intermediaries, he transported a bag from San Antonio to a contact at the Huntsville Walls unit. That bag, according to the court record, contained 4 .357 Magnum pistols, a .38 caliber pistol, ammunition, and $500 in cash. The weapons were smuggled into the prison, hidden inside hollowed-out hams and cans of peaches, past a food order delivery. Fred Carrasco used those guns in the 11-day hostage siege that ended with his death on August 3, 1974. Alonso was arrested, tried, and convicted of introducing a deadly weapon into a penal institution with intent to facilitate an escape, a charge enhanced by 2 prior felony convictions. The sentence was life. He entered a Texas state prison and, according to official records, has never left. He has been denied parole 21 times. He has been held in administrative segregation, the formal name for what most people understand as solitary confinement, for decades. When sources interviewed him, he was in his 80s, suffering from prostate cancer and hepatitis C, his liver in advanced decline. He remained the vice president of the Mexicanemi. The title, like Huerta's own, was for life. Huerta was sentenced to life in federal prison in 1993, following a federal indictment that swept up him and a number of his fellow gang members on racketeering, narcotics, and heroin charges. He was transferred to the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known in the federal system as the ADX, or more informally as the Supermax, the most restrictive correctional facility in the United States. Florence is where the government sends people it never wants to leave. Inmates there are confined to their cells for 23 hours per day, with almost no contact with other human beings. It is designed, explicitly, to remove a prisoner from any capacity to organize, communicate, or direct anything on the outside. Huerta, by the account of law enforcement experts and court documents across 3 decades, continued to run the Texas Mexican Mafia from inside that cell. Gang intelligence experts testified in multiple trials that he maintained control, that he had issued orders resulting in the deaths of people who challenged his authority, and that despite the absolute restriction of his daily environment, the organization continued to identify him as president. He never came out. The organization never stopped operating. A San Antonio police officer named Valentin Lopez, who had dedicated much of his professional career to investigating the gang, testified in a 2005 trial that he had gone to high school with Heriberto Huerta in San Antonio before Huerta entered the prison system for the first time. That detail lands quietly, but it is worth sitting with. the man who built the most powerful criminal organization in South Texas, the organization whose members, sources say, were responsible for at least 10% of San Antonio's total homicide rate at certain points, was not someone who arrived from elsewhere. He grew up in the city. He was someone's classmate. The ground the Texas Mexican Mafia operated on was the same ground Huerta had grown up on, and the authority he exercised over it never required his physical presence in it after 1993. By the early 90s, the consequences of the organization's street-level operations were visible across San Antonio in a way that even casual observers could not miss. In 1993, the year Huerta was convicted and sent to Florence, the San Antonio Police Department recorded 1,262 drive-by shootings across the city. Homicides that year totaled 222. Law enforcement would later identify 1993 as the peak year for gang violence in Bexar County, a year in which the intersection of the Mexicanemi's expanding taxation apparatus and competing street gangs produced a level of sustained urban violence that overwhelmed every available resource. Officers from the Narcotics Division who worked through that period described it in later interviews as genuinely rough, a city in which federal coordination, community initiatives, and sheer accumulation of intelligence work were the only tools capable of making a dent. By 1997, drive-by shootings had fallen to 212. By 2001, they were down to 89. That reduction did not mean the organization had weakened. It meant the organization had become more sophisticated and more careful. The operational model that the Mexicanemi developed during these years, and which federal prosecutors spent the following 2 decades trying to dismantle case by case, was built around a single elegant mechanism that any economist would recognize. Every drug dealer operating in San Antonio who was not a card-carrying member of the organization was required to pay a 10% tax on their drug proceeds, a tithe the gang called the dime. The collection of the dime was not optional. It was enforced through a structured escalation of consequences so predictable that it functioned, in practice, as a pricing menu. When the Mexicanemi identified a dealer operating in their territory, representatives visited that dealer and explained the arrangement. They assessed the dime based on estimated sales volume. They calculated any back taxes and penalties owed. In some cases, a car could be offered instead of cash. If the dealer agreed, he was folded into the organization's tax base and allowed to continue operating under the gang's protection. If he refused, the visit that followed was not a conversation. Armed members would arrive at the dealer's home, beat him, and take his cash, his drugs, and whatever else of value could be carried out. If that visit did not produce compliance, a third approach was made. The front door was kicked in, all occupants inside the residence were beaten, sometimes tied up, and the premises were stripped of anything with a resale value: narcotics, jewelry, electronics, firearms, vehicles. Court documents referred to this final visit as a door kick. After a door kick, all dealers began paying the tax. There is no recorded case in the federal trial record of a dealer successfully refusing past that point. The revenue this mechanism generated flowed upward through the organization's hierarchy. Some of it was deposited into the commissary accounts of incarcerated leaders, a practice that produced one of the more unusual federal asset seizure actions in San Antonio's legal history. When investigators filed a seizure warrant targeting funds in Huerta's commissary account in Florence, they found $13,000. Benito Alonso's account held $10,000. The government contended both balances were the product of dime collections on the outside, moving through intermediaries until they arrived in 2 prison accounts belonging to 2 men who had not been free in decades. That detail captures something essential about how the organization operated. The money went where the power was, and the power was behind bars. Federal prosecutions followed one after another over the 15 years that followed Huerta's 1993 conviction, and each one peeled back another layer of the organization's street operations in San Antonio. In 1998, a second major federal indictment brought down Robert Perez, a Mexican mafia general, along with 15 fellow gang members, for a pattern of racketeering that included 6 murders committed in San Antonio in 1994 and 1995. A subsequent indictment in 2004 targeted 26 ranking members and associates on drug, firearms, and money laundering charges. That investigation estimated that the defendants had been responsible for distributing over 150 kilograms of cocaine and over 30 kilograms of heroin during the 5 years beginning in August 1999. A 2008 investigation, led by the FBI and San Antonio police, arrested more than 30 members on racketeering charges and cleared more than 20 unsolved homicides dating back to the year 2000. By 2009, prosecutors were reporting that more than 130 members had been sent to federal prison since 2004 alone, and that a fourth batch of federal indictments in 15 years had named 23 defendants and alleged a pattern of racketeering connected to 22 killings across San Antonio, Austin, and Atascosa County. None of it closed the organization. After each major prosecution, younger members rose to fill the positions vacated by those convicted. Gabe Morales, a gang intelligence expert who testified in multiple cases, described the dynamic plainly. He said that the continual cycle of prison and release is not a disruption to an organization like the Mexicanemi. It is the organization. Men go into prison, are schooled in the gang's structure and rules and expectations, and emerge onto the street already oriented, already owing obligations, already integrated into the hierarchy. The same prison system that is supposed to contain the organization functions, in practice, as its training ground and its executive suite at the same time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Huerta built an organization designed to survive exactly what happened to him, and it did. But controlling a city from a supermax cell requires generals on the ground, and what those generals did with that authority is one of the darkest chapters in San Antonio's history. Section 3. The General and the West French Place Massacre. On the evening of August 8, 1997, 5 people were shot dead inside a residence on West French Place on San Antonio's west side. They were bound with duct tape before they were killed. The weapons used were shotguns. The total cash recovered from the apartment afterward was $300. The only other item taken of any significance was 5 pounds of marijuana. Prosecutors who would later work the case described those killings as the most violent and bloody gangland-style execution in San Antonio's history at the time, a benchmark that, in a city that had recorded 222 homicides only 4 years earlier, carries real weight. The man at the center of what followed, the man prosecutors would spend the better part of a decade trying to hold legally accountable for those 5 deaths, and for the deaths of more than a dozen other people, was a San Antonio West Sider named Robert Anthony Martinez Perez, known inside the Mexicanemi and on the streets of Bexar County by a single word: Beaver. Perez had not arrived at the rank of general through politics or paperwork. He arrived there through the specific qualities that the Texas Mexican Mafia's structure rewarded above all others: through charisma, through ruthlessness, and through a willingness to use violence not as a last resort, but as an opening position. He had a previous conviction for attempted manslaughter before the events described in this section, stemming from a 1986 domestic incident in which he stabbed a man multiple times in the heart and stomach. That conviction produced a 10-year sentence. He was paroled in August 1990. While on parole, he picked up additional convictions for aggravated assault and evading arrest, was returned briefly to prison in 1992, and was paroled again after 4 months. During that period, parole for repeat offenders was common in Texas, the result of strict population caps imposed on the state prison system by a federal judge. The consequence of that policy, applied at scale, was that men like Perez cycled in and out of custody quickly enough to remain operational on the street almost continuously. He was on parole at the time of the events for which he would eventually receive a death sentence. The internal crisis that gave Perez his opening to rise inside the Mexicanemi began in 1994, when the federal prosecution of Heriberto Huerta produced a leadership vacuum at the top of the organization's San Antonio division. Huerta, from his prison cell, responded to the vacancy by naming a woman, Diane Laura Guzman, as general of the San Antonio division. That appointment fractured the organization along loyalist and challenger lines in a way that produced immediate and lethal consequences on the streets. Luis Adames, known inside the organization as Blue, rejected the appointment and declared himself the new president of the gang's San Antonio chapter. The organization split into two armed factions. On one side stood Adames and those who supported his claim. On the other stood the loyalists to Huerta's directive, a group that included Robert Perez, a man named Robert Herrera who served as Perez's closest partner, and a third associate named Frank Estrada. The war between those factions produced its first confirmed casualty on April 17, 1994. On that evening, Perez, Herrera, and Estrada spotted a vehicle associated with the Adames faction moving through a San Antonio street. They went home, armed themselves, returned to the area, and found three men connected to the rival faction. Two of them were brothers named Jose and Jesse Travieso, and a third man named Robert Rivas. What followed was a shooting. Jose Travieso, 34 years old and wheelchair-bound from injuries sustained in a prior shooting, was killed. Robert Rivas, 27, was killed. Jesse Travieso was wounded and survived. Jesse Travieso would later testify against Perez at trial. His testimony, combined with that of two of Perez's own companions from that night, and an informant who had served as Perez's triggerman on another occasion, formed the spine of the case that would ultimately send Perez to death row. Over the years that followed that April evening, Perez climbed through the organization's hierarchy and eventually assumed the rank of general in San Antonio, a position he used to direct violence across the city with a systematic quality that prosecutors would spend years documenting. By the mid-1990s, the Mexican Mafia essentially had a stranglehold on San Antonio, in the words of the prosecution team that would eventually bring Perez to trial. He controlled one of the gang's primary factions alongside Robert Herrera, who served as his right-hand man, and the network they ran collected the dime tax across the west side while using targeted killings to enforce discipline, eliminate rivals, and silence anyone who knew too much about the organization's operations. The killings Perez ordered during this period have a pattern to them that reveals the internal logic of how an organization like the Mexicanemi maintains control. Some deaths were ordered for strategic reasons, to eliminate rivals in the ongoing internal war with the Adames faction. Luis Adames himself was eventually killed, an outcome that Perez not only ordered but planned in detail. Other deaths were ordered for disciplinary reasons, to punish members who had violated internal rules or who represented a potential vulnerability. Emilio Barrera Alejandro died as a result of 13 gunshot wounds, 11 to the head and 2 to the chest. Ernest Wabara died from 12 gunshot wounds. Both were killed in the context of the ongoing internal power struggle. A man named Adam Tenorio was killed because he had disobeyed an order not to discuss the West French Place killings outside sanctioned channels. He died from 11 stab wounds. A man named Robert de los Santos was killed for the same reason. He died from blunt force trauma and strangulation. Daniel Moreno was killed as an example to other members after he had failed to perform a task he had volunteered to complete. He died from 2 gunshot wounds, one to the face, one to the chest. A man named Eligilio de la Garza, known as Chico, had made statements suggesting that Perez had ordered the West French Place killings. He died from 11 gunshot wounds, including 5 to the head. That final detail is the one worth pausing on. De la Garza was killed, by the account of those who worked the case, because he told people what he knew about West French Place. Which means the killing of de la Garza was itself a consequence of West French Place. Which means the 5 people who died in that apartment on August 8, 1997, produced at minimum 1 additional death, simply by virtue of someone knowing too much about how they died. This is how violence compounds inside a closed organization. Each act of violence creates a circle of witnesses and participants who know about it, and each of those people represents a liability, and managing that liability requires more violence, and each new act of violence creates its own new circle. The men who understood this dynamic most clearly, at the time, were the federal prosecutors building cases against the organization. They were looking at a body count that kept rising, not only from drug transactions and territorial disputes, but from the organization's own attempts to contain the evidence of previous killings. The events at West French Place on August 8, 1997 themselves remain, in one specific legal sense, genuinely contested. The prosecution's theory was that Perez ordered his soldiers to raid the apartment for drugs and cash and ordered them to leave no witnesses. The defense, and at least two former Mexicanami members who testified, suggested that a gang lieutenant had organized the raid independently because of a personal grudge against someone inside the apartment, and that the decision to kill all 5 people present was made by those in the room rather than by Perez at a remove. What is not contested is the raid itself. What is not contested is that all 5 occupants of the apartment were bound with duct tape. What is not contested is that all 5 were shot with shotguns and died on the premises. And what is not contested is that the haul from the apartment, for which 5 people were killed, amounted to $300 in cash and 5 pounds of marijuana. The mathematics of that outcome, whatever its precise chain of command, describe a violence that had become so routine inside the organization that it no longer required a proportionate economic justification. Perez was arrested at his home in November of 1994, 7 months after the April shooting of Travieso and Rivas, the double murder that would ultimately form the basis of his capital murder conviction. Police discovered $30,000 in cash at his residence, a magazine clip loaded with ammunition, and a large quantity of jewelry. The West French Place killings in 1997 occurred while Perez was already on the federal government's radar. A federal trial held in 1999 made Perez a co-defendant alongside several other alleged Mexicanami members on charges connected to those 5 killings, and the outcome of that case would feed directly into the state capital murder trial that sealed his fate. The state trial moved from San Antonio to Dallas because of the volume of local publicity surrounding the case, produced a punishment phase that the defense attorney who represented Perez later described as absolutely gruesome. Prosecutors established evidence connected to between 12 and 18 homicides, all of which occurred according to federal prosecutor Mary Green, who had worked the case from the beginning, while Perez was serving as general of the Mexican Mafia in San Antonio. She told the press afterward that she had found out later that he never actually pulled the trigger in most of those cases. The others were ones he ordered through the years. Jurors sentenced him to death. He declined to testify at his own trial. There is a legal complexity in Perez's case that the jury clearly weighed and rejected, but that is worth noting because it surfaces in almost every prosecution of this kind. A principal who does not physically commit a murder is substantially harder to convict than the person who pulled the trigger. The prosecution of Perez required the testimony of men who had themselves participated in killings, men who received immunity or reduced charges in exchange for their cooperation, men whose own criminal histories made them difficult witnesses in front of any jury. One government witness received immunity for 6 murders in exchange for testimony that helped convict several Mexican mafia leaders in the 1998 federal case. The defense in every such prosecution raises the obvious question: why should a jury believe a man confessing to murder in exchange for his own freedom? The answer the prosecution gives, consistently, is that corroboration from physical evidence, independent witnesses, and the internal logic of the organization's own records makes the testimony credible regardless of the witness's motives. It is an argument that worked in Perez's case in front of 2 separate juries across 2 separate trials. Perez was executed at the Huntsville unit on March 6, 2007. He was 48 years old. He had been a father of 8. He had a 9th grade education. He had, by the account of the prosecution team that worked his case for years, risen to the pinnacle of one of the most violent criminal organizations in Texas, using charisma and ruthlessness as his primary tools, and had ordered the deaths of somewhere between 12 and 18 people from that position. He declined to speak to reporters in the weeks before his execution. He did not make a final statement in the conventional sense. He was the 7th prisoner executed in Texas that year. The prosecutor Mary Green, who had dedicated years to building the cases against the Mexicanami's San Antonio leadership, reflected afterward on the organization's resilience in a way that cut to the heart of why this section matters beyond the specific facts of Perez's case. The Mexican mafia, she noted, had not been broken by Huerta's 1993 conviction. It had not been broken by the 1998 prosecution that convicted Perez and 15 co-defendants. It had not been broken by the subsequent prosecutions that followed. Each round of convictions produced a temporary disruption and a lasting trial record, but the underlying structure continued to function because the structure had been designed to absorb exactly that kind of disruption. When Huerta was convicted and sent to Florence, Perez rose. When Perez was arrested and eventually executed, others rose behind him. The faces changed. The rank structure, the dime tax, the door kicks, the sanctioned hits on members who talked, all of it continued. What the Perez case made visible, in ways the earlier prosecutions had not quite achieved, was the granularity of the violence. It was not anonymous gang violence in any statistical sense. It was organized, logged, deliberate, with each killing serving a function inside a system of social control that the Mexicanemi maintained over its own members and over the broader criminal economy of San Antonio's west side. Emilio Barrera Alejandro, 11 shots. Ernest Ibarra, 12 shots. Adam Tenorio, 11 stab wounds for discussing a prior killing. Robert de los Santos, beaten to death for the same offense. Daniel Moreno, 2 shots for failing to complete a task. These are not random numbers. They are the product of an organization that treated violence the way a business treats its accounts payable, as a scheduled and necessary cost, paid out in full and on time, with consequences for any party that failed to do the same. The 5 people killed at West French Place on August 8, 1997, were bound before they were shot. Their names, in the way that these things tend to disappear into the abstraction of case numbers and trial transcripts, have not endured in public memory the way Perez's name has. That is a consistent feature of how organized crime is documented and remembered. The perpetrators become the narrative. The people they killed become the body count. What the trial record preserves, however imperfectly, is the detail that all 5 of them were alive when the tape went around their wrists, and that the apartment was searched while they were bound, and that whoever was in that room that night made a decision, with those 5 people present and restrained, and that $300 and 5 pounds of marijuana were the only things that left the building afterward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Robert Perez died on a gurney in Huntsville for the killings of 2 men, while the organization he ran continued without him. Behind him came a new generation of San Antonio generals, and the tax collection never stopped. Section 4. The General Who Taxed a City. A federal arrest team moved through San Antonio on the morning of May 19, 2017, picking up defendants one by one across the city's quadrants, executing warrants that had been sealed while investigators built the case around them. By the time the operation was finished, 26 individuals were in custody. 3 others were already sitting in federal or state holding on unrelated charges. 4 remained fugitives. The centerpiece of the indictment, the figure whose name appeared first on the charging document and whose arrest drew the most attention from the agencies involved, was a 54-year-old San Antonio man named Raul Ramos. His handles inside the organization were Alto, Naranjo, and GQ. His rank, as of at least January 1, 2015, was Texas Mexican Mafia Free World General, based in San Antonio. He was the man sitting at the top of the organization's street-level hierarchy in the city that Huerta had designated as the gang's permanent capital, and he had been running that position with enough competence and enough care to stay out of federal custody for years, while 37 people around him were swept up in the investigation that eventually named them all. The investigation that produced the 2017 indictment had begun accumulating its evidence well before the arrests. The FBI, the DEA, the Department of Homeland Security, the San Antonio Police Department, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Bexar County Sheriff's Office, and several county-level agencies in the surrounding area had all contributed to the case, which was designated an Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force investigation. The breadth of that coalition tells you something about how seriously federal law enforcement had come to regard the Mexicanemi's San Antonio operation by the middle of the decade. This was not a single-agency narcotics case built around a controlled buy and a search warrant. It was a multi-year, multi-agency investigation aimed at mapping the full command structure of the organization's free world hierarchy and charging all of it simultaneously, from the general down to the soldiers collecting the dime on residential streets in Hondo and Floresville and New Braunfels. Ramos was not a man who had arrived at the generalship through accident or proximity. He had been inside the Mexicanemi long enough and had climbed carefully enough to reach the organization's highest street-level rank in San Antonio, while avoiding the federal prosecutions that had removed every generation of leadership before him. The 2009 indictment had cleared more than 20 unsolved homicides and sent dozens of members to federal prison. The 2004 sweep had netted 26 ranking members and produced convictions connecting the organization to more than 150 kilograms of cocaine and 30 kilograms of heroin. Ramos had been present, in the organizational sense, through all of those prosecutions. He had watched his predecessors fall and had made the adjustments necessary to remain in place. By 2015, when court records place him formally at the rank of Free World General, he was running the kind of operation that those earlier prosecutions had described in their indictments, but had never quite been able to fully decapitate. The mechanism he oversaw was the same one Heriberto Huerta had written into the organization's constitution 30 years earlier, refined through decades of practice into something close to a routine. Every drug dealer operating in TMM claimed territory in and around San Antonio was located, identified, and visited. The visit was conducted by soldiers operating under the direction of lieutenants, who reported upward to captains, who reported to Ramos. During the initial visit, the gang's representatives explained the arrangement in terms the dealer could understand. 10% of all drug proceeds, paid regularly, in exchange for the right to continue operating without interference. The amount was assessed based on estimated sales volume. Back taxes and penalties, calculated from the date the dealer had begun operating in the territory, were added to the total. Property, specifically vehicles, could be accepted in lieu of cash when cash was not immediately available. The escalation procedure that followed a refusal was methodical enough that it appears in federal court documents as a documented sequence of steps rather than as an improvised response. If a dealer declined to pay after the initial visit, he was robbed and beaten on the spot. If that was not sufficient to produce compliance, a door kick followed. Armed members of the organization arrived at the dealer's residence, forced entry, gathered all occupants in a central location, restrained them in some cases, and stripped the premises of every item of value: narcotics, cash, weapons, electronics, jewelry, vehicles. After a door kick, according to the trial record, all dealers began paying the tax. The phrase appears in federal sentencing documents verbatim and without qualification. It is stated as a fact about how the system worked, not as an allegation to be tested. In the language of the federal court record, dealers have no choice. Payment of the tax is mandatory. The rule is enforced through violence. The geographic reach of Ramos's operation extended well beyond San Antonio proper. The 38th Judicial District Attorney's Office in Hondo, Texas, a small city about 40 miles west of San Antonio in Medina County, had obtained more than 50 state indictments of TMM members and their associates in the Hondo area alone before the federal indictment was unsealed in May 2017. That detail reflects something important about how the Mexicanemi operated under Ramos. The dime tax was not confined to the city limits of San Antonio. It followed the organization's territory lines, which ran through the smaller communities surrounding the city, through Medina County and Atascosa County and Comal County, through the corridor connecting San Antonio to New Braunfels to the north, and to Hondo and Uvalde to the west. A dealer operating in Floresville, 40 miles southeast of San Antonio, was in Texas Mexican Mafia territory as surely as a dealer operating in the shadow of the Alamodome. Ramos oversaw that entire structure from San Antonio, receiving information from lieutenants operating across the region and issuing instructions that flowed back down the chain. The indictment against the 37 defendants named in the 2017 case covered conspiracy to interfere with commerce by threats or violence, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, specifically heroin and methamphetamine, possession with intent to distribute, and the use or discharge of a firearm in connection with a drug trafficking crime. The drug conspiracy charge alleged that the defendants had been responsible for distributing heroin and methamphetamine throughout the territory since at least January 2015. The firearms charge carried a mandatory 10-year sentence consecutive to any other term imposed. The extortion conspiracy count alone exposed defendants to up to 20 years. For the drug distribution charges, the range was 5 years to 40 years, or in some cases, 5 years to life depending on the quantities involved. Among the 37 defendants named alongside Ramos were men and women spanning a range of ages and operational roles inside the organization. Johnny Ramon Fonseca, known as Mad Cow, was 44 and based in San Antonio. Pedro Torres, known as Infamous, was 34 and based in Floresville. Jesus Rodriguez, known as Texas, was 29. Frederick Rocha, known as Lil Mac, was 38. Oscar Martinez, known as Pelon, was 70 and based in Laredo. Jose Luis Cortez, known as Listo and as T-Bone, was 40 and based in San Antonio. Mark Thomas Reyes, known as Panda, was 29. Jimmy Fonseca, known as Goon, was 30. Daniel Garza, known as Yogi, was 46. The list ran the full length of the organization's hierarchy, from leadership-adjacent figures who reported directly to Ramos, down to the soldiers and associates who executed the street-level collections. Among the 8 defendants already in custody before the operation began was Oscar Martinez, the 70-year-old Laredo-based member whose age illustrates something true of any organization with a constitution and a life membership requirement. Men do not age out. They remain members until they die or are convicted, and sometimes both. Ramos himself pleaded guilty on May 2, 2018, to 1 count of conspiracy to commit extortion, 1 count of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and 1 count of prohibited person in possession of a firearm. In entering that plea, he acknowledged his role as Free World General, acknowledged his direction of the tax collection operation across San Antonio's territory, and acknowledged the violence that enforced it. He did not, in the account of the plea hearing as reflected in the appellate record, admit to personally collecting the dime. He acknowledged knowing that it was being collected. He acknowledged owning at least 1 kilogram of heroin. He acknowledged that members under his command had been ordered to commit acts of violence. The appellate court, reviewing the sufficiency of the plea's factual basis after Ramos subsequently challenged it, found that his admitted knowledge of the TMM's drug trafficking activities, combined with the testimony of co-conspirators about his orders, provided sufficient grounds to uphold every count. The sentencing hearing on October 9, 2019, took place before U.S. District Judge Xavier Rodriguez in San Antonio. Ramos's defense attorneys argued for a more lenient term. They noted that Ramos had suffered from a substance abuse problem for nearly 40 years and had dropped out of school in the 7th grade. They contested the government's characterization of his seniority within the hierarchy, arguing that the prosecution's description of his role overstated the degree of his formal authority. Judge Rodriguez was not persuaded. He sentenced Ramos to life in federal prison on the drug conspiracy count, concurrent with a 20-year term on the extortion count. He was also ordered to pay a monetary judgment of $275,500, representing a portion of the profits derived from the extortion scheme. Ramos was 54 years old at sentencing. He joined Heriberto Huerta in the federal prison system, separated from the city he had spent years taxing, in a cell that would be his for the rest of his life. The sentencing of Ramos produced a tally. As of October 2019, the single prosecution stemming from the 2017 indictment had resulted in convictions for 37 Texas Mexican Mafia members and associates. 21 of those convictions had resulted in life sentences. That number, 21 life sentences from a single investigation, gives some indication of the scale of the operation Ramos had been running and of the depth of the government's commitment to dismantling it. 16 additional defendants were still awaiting sentencing at the time of Ramos's own hearing. Among the notable individual outcomes within the same prosecution was the case of Robert Eugene Hernandez, known as Gino, a 51-year-old San Antonio East Side lieutenant who had carried out his duties under Ramos's direct supervision. Hernandez was convicted by a federal jury on July 2, 2019, on multiple counts including interference with commerce by threats or extortion, conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and heroin, and firearms charges. He was sentenced on December 5, 2019, to 35 years in federal prison, with 5 years of supervised release to follow. The Hernandez sentencing documents contain the clearest available description of how the tax collection system functioned at the operational level in San Antonio during the years Ramos ran it. Those documents describe the sequence from initial identification of a dealer through confirmation, approach, first visit, robbery if refused, door kick if still refused, and the final state of compliance. They note that soldiers were instructed to confirm a dealer's operations, usually through a controlled purchase, before the formal approach was made. They note that once a dealer was identified, the information was passed up to the leadership, which means it reached Ramos. They note that Ramos's East Side lieutenant, Hernandez, was the operational layer between that command decision and the men who knocked on doors. They note that after a door kick, all dealers begin paying the tax. The phrase, again, as a statement of established operational fact. What the Ramos prosecution clarified, in ways that earlier rounds of indictments had not quite managed to do, was the degree to which the Mexicanemi's San Antonio operation had, by the mid-2010s, evolved into something more closely resembling a mature criminal bureaucracy than a street gang. The organization divided the city into quadrants. Each quadrant had a lieutenant. The lieutenant reported to a captain. The captain reported to the general. Information about dealers moved up the chain. Instructions moved back down. Money moved in the same direction as instructions. From the street to the leadership, a percentage of everything extracted from every dealer operating in a defined geographic area, collected through a process that followed documented steps and produced documented outcomes. The men doing the collecting were not freelancers. They were members of an organization with a written constitution, a defined rank structure, lifetime membership requirements, and a clear internal jurisprudence governing what happened to anyone who violated the rules. A gang intelligence expert named Gabe Morales, who had testified in TMM prosecutions across 2 decades and was one of the most cited authorities on the organization's structure, described the resilience of the model in terms that the Ramos prosecution ultimately confirmed. He said that as long as there is supply and demand in the drug world, groups like this will exist. He said that sending members to the federal prison system risks spreading the organization rather than containing it, the same pattern seen with the Aryan Brotherhood, which started in California and spread to 40 states as members were transferred through the federal system. He said that a dent could be put in the organization, but that totally obliterating it would be very difficult. The Ramos prosecution put a dent in it. 21 life sentences, 37 convictions, $275,000 in forfeiture. A dent. The organization restructured around the gap and continued. There is one final detail in the Ramos case worth sitting with, because it connects the 2019 sentencing to everything that came before it across this video. Raul Ramos held the rank of Free World General in San Antonio. That rank existed because Heriberto Huerta, the founder of the organization, was not free. The Free World General was, by design, the operational command layer that a president who could never leave prison required in order to run a city he could no longer physically inhabit. Ramos existed because Huerta's system demanded his existence. When Ramos was sentenced to life, the system that produced him demanded another. The name changed. The rank did not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Raul Ramos ran San Antonio like a ledger, and prosecutors spent years building the case that proved it. But the Mexicanemi was never the only organization operating in San Antonio's criminal economy. On the other side of the city's prison gang landscape sat an older and in some ways equally structured rival, one whose roots reached back even further than Huerta's constitution. Section 5. The oldest gang in Texas. Sometime in the early 1970s, inside the general population blocks of Folsom State Prison in California, a group of men from Texas decided they needed to organize. The immediate reason was practical and violent. California's prison system in that era was dominated by established gang structures. The Aryan Brotherhood on one side, the California Mexican Mafia on the other, and native Texan inmates were arriving in the federal and interstate prison population without any affiliated protection and were being preyed upon as a consequence. The men who responded to that vulnerability were not, in the main, from San Antonio. They were Texans broadly, men who shared a state identity more than a city one, and the organization they built reflected that broader geography. They called it the Texas Syndicate, in Spanish, Sindicato Tejano, and they built it around a single foundational rule that distinguished it from the beginning from every other gang its members had encountered. The rule was simple. Texas comes first. Before family, before friendship, before any obligation to any other person or institution, the Texas Syndicate comes first. Membership, once accepted, was permanent. There was no exit. The Texas Syndicate returned to Texas with its founding members as they cycled back through the state prison system, and by the late 1970s it had established itself inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice as a recognized and feared presence. Its rivalry with the Mexicanemi, which would come to define much of San Antonio's prison gang landscape across the following decades, was not immediate. The Mexicanemi did not exist until Huerta formed it in 1984, more than a decade after the syndicate's founding. When the two organizations did come into direct conflict, the violence was immediate and sustained. Prison gang experts who have tracked the history of both organizations describe the Texas Syndicate's predatory treatment of unaffiliated Hispanic inmates in Texas prisons as one of the direct catalysts for Huerta's decision to form the Mexicanemi in the first place. A man named Gabe Morales, who spent years studying and testifying about Texas prison gang dynamics, described the sequence plainly. The Texas Syndicate was killing a lot of Hispanic and Mexican-American inmates in Texas prisons, especially those from the San Antonio area, and the response was the formation of a protection group that became the Mexicanemi. The protection group became more dangerous than what it was protecting against. By the 1990s, the Syndicate and the Mexicanemi occupied the same city in a state of armed coexistence that federal and state prosecutors described as a treaty more than a peace. The two organizations were formally rivals, officially hostile to each other in the prison system's gang classification records, and capable of sustained lethal violence against each other when the circumstances demanded it. Outside prison, however, in the streets and neighborhoods of San Antonio where both organizations collected taxes and moved product, the relationship was more pragmatic. Other powerful prison gangs operating in San Antonio, including the Barrio Azteca and various smaller organizations, operated under what sources with knowledge of the arrangement described as a treaty with the Mexicanemi. The syndicate maintained its own operational territory and its own revenue streams. Competition for those streams produced violence. Encroachment produced retaliation. But the outright war that defined the two organizations' prison relationship did not translate continuously into the city's streets, because both organizations understood that sustained open conflict was bad for business and invited federal attention. The Texas Syndicate's operational structure on the street mirrored the Mexicanemi's in its most important features while differing in its geographic emphasis. Membership was restricted to Texas-born Mexican-American males, a narrower ethnic definition than the Mexicanemi's, and the organization's rules made explicit what that restriction meant in practice. A member had to be a Texan. He had to place the Texas Syndicate before anything else in his life. He had to wear the organization's tattoo. He had to keep all gang information within the group. He could never break away. Every released or paroled member who generated income was required to surrender 10% of all proceeds to the organization, the same dime structure the Mexicanemi used, reflecting the reality that both organizations had drawn from the same well of California Mexican Mafia operational doctrine when designing their revenue models. The enforcement mechanism for non-payment was identical in its logic to the Mexicanemi's. Members who failed to remit faced penalties that could escalate to death. The word used inside the organization for a member who had fallen out of favor or violated the rules was muleta, a term meaning problem. A muleta had a green light against him. Having a green light meant anyone in the organization who encountered him was authorized to kill him. The communication infrastructure the Texas Syndicate built to maintain coordination between its incarcerated leadership and its street-level members was sophisticated enough that law enforcement agencies spent years documenting it before they fully understood its mechanics. Members in prison maintained contact with members on the outside through letters and telephone calls conducted in coded language. The codes were not improvised. They followed established conventions that members were expected to learn and use consistently. A name with an X drawn over it in a letter indicated that the named individual was targeted for elimination. A reference to someone having a green light carried the same meaning. Referring to a targeted individual in the feminine grammatical form was another signal, a way of marking someone as a problem without stating it in terms a corrections officer reading the letter would recognize. Rival gang members were also referred to in the feminine. The layer of deniability this created was real. A letter that said nothing more threatening than that a mutual acquaintance was behaving like a woman could, in the organization's internal language, be an instruction to kill that person. Proving that in court required years of testimony from people who understood the code from the inside. The syndicate's drug trafficking operation in and around San Antonio drew its supply from Mexican drug trafficking organizations operating across the border, primarily through working relationships with the Gulf Cartel and, at various points, with Los Zetas. Members smuggled multi-kilogram quantities of powdered cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine from Mexico across the Texas border and distributed them through networks operating inside and outside the prison system simultaneously. The border crossing points used by the organization ran along the same South Texas geography that every other trafficking organization in this video exploited, through Laredo, through the Rio Grande Valley, north along the Interstate 35 corridor toward San Antonio, where the product entered a distribution network that reached outward from the city into the surrounding region. Street networks in South Texas facilitated the smuggling and the local distribution, supplying smaller quantities to affiliated street gangs and independent dealers operating under the syndicate's territorial authorization. In 2007, federal authorities in San Antonio, working through the same Western District of Texas that had prosecuted successive waves of Mexicanemi members, returned a racketeering indictment against more than 30 members of the Texas Syndicate for murder and other crimes. Among those charged was Jacinto Navajar, known inside the organization as Cash, a purported gang general. The case targeted the same structural feature that every major Texas prison gang prosecution had identified as the organization's central vulnerability and its central strength simultaneously: the fact that incarcerated leaders directed extramural violence and narcotics distribution through a chain of command that was clear enough internally to function as an organization, but diffuse enough externally to make direct attribution of specific criminal acts to specific individuals, a years-long evidentiary challenge. The indictment alleged acts committed from inside Texas prisons, orders given through coded letters and telephone calls, violence carried out on the streets of San Antonio and the surrounding region by men who received those instructions through layers of organizational structure specifically designed to insulate the people giving them. A subsequent investigation in 2011 targeted the syndicate's San Antonio area operations more specifically. That investigation, involving the DEA, the FBI, and local agencies, led to the indictment of 18 Texas syndicate members on charges that alleged conspiracy in a criminal enterprise responsible for 4 murders, 3 attempted murders, and methamphetamine distribution. The arrests connected to that indictment swept up 23 associates across Hondo and Uvalde counties, extending the investigation's reach well into the same rural and semi-rural territory that the Mexicanemi's dime collection network also claimed. That geographic overlap, the presence of both organizations in the same small communities west of San Antonio, produced the kind of friction that the organization's street-level treaty was supposed to manage, but could not always contain. One specific incident illustrates the texture of the syndicate's San Antonio operations at the street level more precisely than any indictment summary. In June 2008, a Texas syndicate member named Emmanuel Camacho Gomez shot and killed a 27-year-old woman named Rose Ann Martinez in San Antonio. The killing was connected to the organization's enforcement activities, another data point in a pattern of violence that accompanied the syndicate's territorial maintenance across the city. It is the kind of case that does not receive extended public attention, that disappears into the aggregated violence statistics that law enforcement agencies compile and that newspapers reference in summary, but that represents for the people connected to Rose Ann Martinez a specific and irreversible loss attached to a specific organization operating in specific streets. The rules governing syndicate membership produced their own internal violence in ways that were equally specific. The requirement that the organization come before family was not rhetorical. Members who received a telephone call instructing them to commit a crime, including homicide, were expected to carry out that instruction regardless of their relationship to the target. A member who failed to do so faced becoming a muleta himself. This created a closed system of obligation in which the threat of violence from within the organization was as constant as any threat from a rival. The organization's own soldiers and prospects were frequently used to carry out the most dangerous enforcement tasks, sometimes as a way of providing members who had committed internal violations an opportunity to work off that violation through demonstrated loyalty. The task might be an assault. It might be a murder. After completing it, the member's standing within the organization was restored. The violence was functional in the most literal sense. The Texas syndicate's longevity, the fact that it remained an active and recognized criminal threat in San Antonio and across South Texas decades after its founding, is best understood through the lens of its founding rule. An organization whose members can never leave does not lose members to attrition in the way that a voluntary association does. Prison does not remove a member. Conviction does not remove a member. Transfer to a federal facility in another state does not remove a member. Death removes a member. Everything short of death keeps the organizational census intact, keeps the network of mutual obligation active, keeps the coded letters moving between cells and addresses across Texas and beyond. The Texas Syndicate had approximately 1,000 members in Texas prisons and jails by the early 2000s, with many additional members operating on the outside. That number reflects only the validated, documented membership. The actual network of associates and affiliates operating in San Antonio's drug economy under the syndicate's umbrella extended well beyond any formal count. What made the syndicate a distinct kind of threat in San Antonio's specific landscape, as distinct from the Mexicanemi's model, was the nature of its external alliances. The Mexicanemi, by the mid-2000s, was working with a range of Mexican drug trafficking organizations including the Sinaloa Cartel, the Juarez Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, and the Zetas, rotating its supply relationships based on price, availability, and the shifting fortunes of the cartel wars across the border. The Texas Syndicate maintained a more concentrated alliance, primarily with the Gulf Cartel, a relationship that gave it access to wholesale quantities of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine at prices that made retail distribution in South Texas extremely profitable. Syndicate members also carried out contract killings for Los Zetas during periods of cartel conflict, a service relationship that gave both parties something they wanted. The Zetas needed enforcers with operational knowledge of the Texas side of the border. The syndicate needed the income and the access that came with being useful to one of the most violent organizations in the Western Hemisphere. That alliance with Los Zetas is worth examining for a moment because it reflects a broader dynamic in San Antonio's criminal economy that is easy to miss if you focus exclusively on the domestic prison gang structures. The city sits at the convergence of several interstate highway corridors and within driving distance of the most active drug smuggling crossing points on the Texas-Mexico border. Every major cartel that operated a distribution network aimed at the American interior had a presence in or through San Antonio, and every major San Antonio prison gang that needed a wholesale drug supply had a cartel relationship of some kind. The Texas Syndicate's relationship with the Gulf Cartel and its service work for the Zetas was not an anomaly. It was the standard operating model for any organization operating at that level in South Texas in that era. The prison gang provided local infrastructure, street-level enforcement, and operational knowledge of the American side. The cartel provided product at favorable prices. Both parties profited. The city absorbed the consequences. By the time the 2011 San Antonio area indictments against the syndicate were fully adjudicated, the pattern that had defined the organization's relationship with federal law enforcement was well established. An investigation would accumulate years of wiretap intercepts, confidential source reporting, surveillance, and financial analysis. A grand jury would return a multi-count indictment naming the organization's leadership and a significant portion of its operational membership. Arrests would follow. Guilty pleas and trials would produce convictions. Life sentences would be handed down, and the organization would restructure around the convictions, drawing on the same pool of returning members that the Texas prison system continuously produced, and continue. The cycle was not a failure of prosecution. It was a structural feature of an organization whose founding rules made it, in important ways, prosecution-resistant by design. You cannot threaten a man who is already sentenced to life with more prison. You cannot use the prospect of a harsher outcome to turn a member against the organization when the organization's own rules make that betrayal a capital offense. The Texas Syndicate had thought about these problems before any federal prosecutor had, and had written the solutions into its constitution before the first indictment was ever filed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Texas Syndicate built itself to last, and in San Antonio it did. But neither the Syndicate nor the Mexicanemi operated in isolation. Threading between them, connected to both the border cartels and the city's street-level drug economy, was a third prison gang whose internal wars and cartel alliances would pull San Antonio deeper into the networks running north from Nuevo Laredo. Section 6. The Brotherhood of Latin Gunmen. Sometime in the early 1980s, inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, a group of Hispanic inmates formed an organization they called the Hermandad de Pistoleros Latinos. The English translation is the Brotherhood of Latin Gunmen, and the name was not chosen for ambiguity. The gang's founding members were drawn from the Rio Grande Valley, the long stretch of South Texas border territory running from Laredo east toward Brownsville, a region whose geography and demographics had long made it a primary corridor for the movement of narcotics north from Mexico. The organization they built was smaller than the Texas Syndicate and smaller than the Mexicanemi, but it occupied a specific and valuable niche in the ecology of South Texas criminal networks, sitting at the intersection of the Texas prison system's internal power structures and the cross-border cartel supply lines running through Nuevo Laredo, the Mexican border city directly across from Laredo that would, over the following decades, become one of the most violent urban environments on the North American continent. The gang that became known simply as HPL, or the Hermanos de Pistoleros Latinos, established its street-level operations primarily in Laredo and the surrounding Rio Grande Valley communities before it began reaching into San Antonio and Houston. That expansion, which accelerated through the 1990s as the organization grew its prison membership and began recruiting from cities beyond its original geographic base, produced an internal fracture that would define the organization for years. The original members from the Rio Grande Valley resented the new recruits being absorbed from San Antonio and Houston. The resentment reflected something real about how prison gangs derive their power from territorial identity. A gang built on a specific geography, whose founding members share a specific cultural and community background, does not absorb outsiders from different cities without friction, because those outsiders bring with them different loyalties, different street networks, different relationships with the rival organizations that the founding members had carefully navigated across years of prison politics. The fracture that resulted divided HPL into two distinct chapters operating under the same name. The original members from the valley designated themselves the HPL 45s, a name drawn from the caliber of handgun that served as one of the organization's primary symbols. The San Antonio and Houston members became known as the 16th 12ths, or the 1612s, a designation derived from the 16th and 12th letters of the alphabet, P and L, the initials of Pistoleros Latinos. The two factions did not peacefully diverge. They went to war. The internal conflict between the 45s and the 1612s ran through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, with enough intensity that outside observers tracking HPL's activities during that period were essentially watching two separate organizations operating under the same name and killing each other for control of it. The war eventually ended, and the two factions reunited under the single HPL designation in 1998. But the reunion did not erase the underlying tension between the organization's border routes and its expanding urban presence in San Antonio and Houston. That tension would continue to shape how the organization operated and how it was perceived by the rival gangs whose territory it was encroaching upon. The alliance that HPL formed with the Mexicanemi in the early 1980s, while both organizations were still finding their footing inside the Texas prison system, was one of the more consequential relationships in San Antonio's prison gang landscape. The alliance was formed primarily in opposition to the Texas Syndicate, which was at that point the dominant force within the Texas prison system and had been preying on non-aligned Hispanic inmates with enough consistency that both the Mexicanemi and HPL found common cause in opposing it. The two organizations entered into what gang intelligence sources described as a 10-year prison gang war against the Texas Syndicate, a sustained conflict that ran from the mid-1980s into the 1990s and defined the internal politics of the Texas prison system across that entire period. The alliance was not without its own violence. The Mexicanemi eventually began assaulting HPL members, breaking the alliance and establishing the pattern of fluid, interest-driven coalition-making that characterized San Antonio's prison gang relationships through the 1990s and beyond. What distinguished HPL from both the Mexicanemi and the Texas Syndicate, and what made it a specific kind of threat in the context of San Antonio's criminal economy, was the directness and depth of its relationship with Mexican drug trafficking organizations operating in Nuevo Laredo. While both the Mexicanemi and the Texas Syndicate maintained cartel supply relationships, those relationships were, in most documented cases, wholesale procurement arrangements. HPL's ties to Nuevo Laredo ran deeper than procurement. The gang maintained its largest contingent outside Texas, not in any American city, but in Nuevo Laredo itself, and its members moved across the border with a regularity and a familiarity that reflected genuine integration into the cartel infrastructure operating on the Mexican side. Sources tracking the organization described HPL as maintaining close ties to several Mexican drug trafficking organizations, involved in the trafficking of large quantities of cocaine and marijuana from Mexico into the United States for distribution. The border crossing point at Laredo was not, for HPL, a logistical challenge to be overcome by ingenuity. It was the organization's home terrain, a corridor it had operated in and around for longer than most of its members had been alive. That geographic positioning made HPL's San Antonio chapter a specific kind of node in the city's drug distribution network. Product entering the United States through Laredo moved north along Interstate 35 towards San Antonio, the same corridor that every trafficking organization in this video used, and HPL members in San Antonio were positioned to receive, store, and distribute that product through their street-level networks in the city. San Antonio sat at the northern terminus of the primary smuggling route running up from the border, close enough to Laredo to maintain operational contact with the organization's border base, but far enough inland to serve as a distribution hub for the surrounding region. The split between the 45s and the 1612s and the subsequent reunification had left the San Antonio chapter of HPL with an established, if internally contested, presence in the city that it continued to build on through the late 90s and into the 2000s. The 2024 federal indictment that produced 24 charges against alleged HPL members and associates in San Antonio represents the most recent major law enforcement action against the organization in the city and offers the clearest available picture of what its San Antonio operations looked like in the contemporary period. The FBI and DEA led the investigation, with assistance from the United States Marshals Service, IRS Criminal Investigations, Customs and Border Protection, the Texas National Guard Counter-Narcotics Task Force, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office, the Bexar County Sheriff's Office, the San Antonio Police Department, the Bourne Police Department, and the New Braunfels Police Department. The breadth of that coalition, 17 separate agencies contributing to a single indictment, reflects both the geographic spread of the organization's operations and the degree to which HPL had become a recognized priority target for federal law enforcement in South Texas by the early 2020s. The charges in the 2024 indictment covered conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute methamphetamine, conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute heroin, conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine, conspiracy to possess firearms in furtherance of drug trafficking, and conspiracy to traffic firearms. If convicted, defendants face sentences ranging from 15 to 20-year maximums on some counts, to 5 years to life on others. Among the named defendants were Jesus Mendoza Jr., known as Chivo, who was 50 years old and based in San Antonio. Gilberto Garcia, known as Jibo, was 42. Ramon Lozoya, known as Bulldog, was 41. Antonio Rios Jr., known as Tone, was 33. Vidal Morales Jr., known as Mo, was 49. Ronald Mendoza, known as Ronnie, was 41. The age range across the indictment told a story consistent with every other major prison gang prosecution in San Antonio's recent history, an organization drawing on members who had been inside it, in some cases, for 2 decades or more, men who had entered the Texas prison system in their 20s and were now approaching or past 50, still operational, still drawing income from the same drug distribution networks they had joined when Ronald Reagan was in the White House. The DEA special agent in charge of the Houston Division, which covers San Antonio, described the indictment in terms that made the HPL's funding model explicit. He stated that members rely on money made outside to fund members behind bars and help HPL as an organization thrive. That description captures the essential economic logic of any prison gang operating in both environments simultaneously. The street-level drug trafficking operation is not primarily a retail business, though it functions as one. It is a revenue generation mechanism whose primary purpose is to sustain the incarcerated portion of the organization. Money flows from the street into the prison system through commissary deposits, legal fees for incarcerated members, support payments for members' families, and various other channels that collectively ensure that a man serving 20 years feels the continued financial and organizational support of the structure he belongs to. That support maintains loyalty. Loyalty maintains silence. Silence protects the people on the outside who are generating the revenue. The cycle is self-reinforcing and deliberately so. The FBI special agent in charge of the San Antonio field office described the indictment's outcome in terms that the agency had used consistently across the preceding decade of San Antonio gang prosecutions. He said that the arrests put a dent into HPL's drug trafficking activities. The word dent has appeared in enough of these statements, across enough years, in connection with enough different organizations operating in San Antonio, to function as something close to an official acknowledgement of the limits of prosecution as a tool for eliminating organizations of this kind. A dent is not a dismantling. A dent is a localized deformation in a surface that retains its overall shape. Every major prosecution documented across this video produced a dent. The Mexicanemi bent around Huerta's conviction and continued. It bent around the death of Robert Perez and continued. It bent around Raul Ramos's life sentence and continued. The Texas Syndicate bent around its 2007 and 2011 indictments and continued. HPL bent around the 2009 conviction of its Laredo-based leader Pedro Gil III on continuing criminal enterprise charges, and continued, its decentralized cell structure allowing it to absorb the loss of leadership without losing the operational capacity that generated revenue. The internal power struggle between HPL's two factions in the late 1980s and the 1990s is worth returning to briefly because it illuminates something specific about San Antonio's place within the organization's geography. The men who formed the 1612s, the San Antonio and Houston chapter, were not absorbed into the Valley-based organization as junior partners. They were absorbed as a parallel structure that immediately began competing for control of the whole. That competitive dynamic produced a war, and then a treaty, and then a reunification, but it never fully resolved the underlying question of which geography the organization served most fundamentally. San Antonio remained a secondary city in HPL's organizational map, subordinate in some respects to the Laredo base and the Nuevo Laredo presence across the river. But secondary in an organization of this kind does not mean unimportant. It means the city sits one level below the primary command structure while generating revenue, receiving product, and providing operational capacity that the primary structure depends on. The specific detail from the 2024 indictment that sits most persistently in the record is the government's description of what HPL's drug trafficking income was actually for. It was for members behind bars. The men named in the indictment, the men in their 40s and 50s moving methamphetamine and heroin and cocaine through San Antonio's streets, were doing so in significant part to keep checks flowing to people in prison cells. Those people in prison cells were, in many cases, the senior members of the organization, the men who had accumulated enough experience and enough seniority to sit at the top of the hierarchy, who were now incarcerated and drawing on the revenue generated by the people below them. The economic relationship between the street and the prison runs in both directions in every organization of this kind. The prison provides the authority structure, the protection from further consequence, and the organizational continuity. The street provides the money. Each side needs the other. The men in the 2024 indictment were the street side of that equation in San Antonio. The firearms trafficking charges in the 2024 indictment add a dimension that the drug distribution charges alone do not capture. Moving weapons is a different kind of business than moving drugs, and its presence alongside the narcotics charges reflects the degree to which HPL's San Antonio operations had become fully integrated into the broader criminal supply chain running through South Texas. Weapons moving south, toward the border, toward the cartel infrastructure in Nuevo Laredo. Drugs moving north, up the Interstate 35 corridor, into San Antonio and beyond. The same organization, the same members, managing both flows simultaneously, earning on both sides of the transaction. The DEA has documented this bi-directional trade across multiple investigations targeting different organizations in San Antonio, and in each case the pattern is the same. The border is not a checkpoint, it is a marketplace, and the organizations that learned to operate on both sides of it built something more durable than any organization confined to one side alone. HPL's longevity in San Antonio, from the formation of the 1612s chapter in the late 1980s to the 2024 federal indictment, spans more than 3 decades of operational activity in the city. Across that period, the organization survived an internal civil war, survived the imprisonment of its Laredo leadership, survived the disruption of its Nuevo Laredo connections during the cartel conflicts of the mid-2000s, and survived successive waves of federal prosecution targeting its membership in San Antonio and across the South Texas corridor. What it could not survive, and what no organization documented in this video has survived, was the complete elimination of the conditions that made it necessary. As long as drugs crossed the border at Laredo, as long as those drugs needed to be distributed through cities north of the border, and as long as men returned from Texas prisons already integrated into the organizational structure that moved those drugs, HPL would find its members on San Antonio's streets doing the same work the 1612s had been doing since the 1980s. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. HPL built its San Antonio chapter on the supply lines running north from Nuevo Laredo, and those lines carried everything the city's drug economy needed. But the men who ran the largest single seizures in San Antonio's recent history were not prison gang members at all. They were cartel operatives working the same corridor, hiding their product in places nobody thought to look. Section 7. 550 kilograms in a box of lettuce. On the morning of February 3, 2026, federal agents from the DEA and FBI, working alongside officers from the San Antonio Police Department's High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Unit, executed a court-authorized search warrant on an office space somewhere in San Antonio. The location itself was not unusual in any visible way. It was a commercial space of the kind that exists in unremarkable clusters across every American city, the sort of address that produces no second glances from the people who drive past it every day. What the agents found inside was not unremarkable. Approximately 100 boxes of fresh heads of lettuce were stacked inside the space, the kind of produce shipment that moves through commercial supply chains across the country every day of the week without attracting any attention at all. Agents searched the lettuce. Inside the heads, packed into the vegetable matter with enough care to survive transportation and avoid casual detection, they found 998 ball-shaped packages of methamphetamine. The total weight was approximately 555 kilograms. 2 men were present or connected to the space. Their names were Gerardo Pineda Gallegos and Jose Lopez Ruiz. They were arrested and charged with 1 count each of conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute 500 grams or more of methamphetamine, a charge carrying a mandatory minimum of 10 years and a potential maximum of life in federal prison and a fine of up to $10 million. 555 kilograms of methamphetamine is a number that requires some context to land with the weight it deserves. A single kilogram of methamphetamine at street-level retail pricing in a major American city represents thousands of individual doses. 555 kilograms is not a supply for a neighborhood or even a city. It is a supply for a regional distribution network, the kind of load that gets broken down at the wholesale level, divided among distributors operating across multiple cities and states, and worked down through successive layers of the retail trade over months of transactions. Finding that quantity inside a commercial space in San Antonio, hidden in vegetable produce boxes, represents the endpoint of a smuggling operation of significant sophistication and scale, one that required the coordination of a supply chain running from a production facility in Mexico, across the border, through whatever intermediate handling points the load passed through, and into that office space in San Antonio. The lettuce was not improvised. Someone had thought carefully about how commercial produce moves through inspection points without generating the kind of attention that a vehicle full of obvious contraband would attract, and had built a method around that observation. The Pineda Gallegos and Lopez Ruiz case is the most recent major seizure in the timeline covered by this video, and it sits at the far end of a long arc of cartel-linked trafficking operations that have run through San Antonio since at least the 1990s. The city's role in that arc is not incidental, it is structural. San Antonio sits approximately 150 miles north of the Laredo crossing point, the busiest commercial port of entry on the United States-Mexico border by cargo volume. Every day, thousands of trucks cross the bridge at Laredo, carrying legitimate commercial goods moving north into the American market. The same infrastructure that makes Laredo the central artery of legal cross-border trade makes it the primary corridor for illegal narcotics moving in the same direction. The trucks carrying fresh produce, consumer electronics, automotive parts, and manufactured goods from Mexican factories provide the volume and the variety of commercial traffic that makes effective inspection of every load a logistical impossibility. Traffickers have understood this since the corridor opened, and they have built their concealment methods around it with a consistency and an ingenuity that has produced some of the most audacious seizures in American drug enforcement history. The lettuce case was audacious by any measure, but it was not unprecedented in its method or its scale when placed against the full history of trafficking operations linked to San Antonio. In 1999, the San Antonio FBI division launched an investigation called Operation Marquee, in partnership with several other federal agencies, targeting a drug trafficking organization that was bringing cocaine and other narcotics into the United States, from Mexico through a network that extended into and through the San Antonio area. That investigation ran for years and ultimately resulted in the arrest of more than 300 people connected to the organization. The scale of Operation Marquee, more than 300 arrests from a single investigation, reflects the depth of the cartel infrastructure that had taken root in South Texas by the end of the 1990s, an infrastructure whose distribution network required that number of people to operate, and whose connections to San Antonio ran deep enough that the city's FBI division treated it as a primary target. The Gulf Cartel's presence in San Antonio's drug economy across this period was not simply a supply relationship mediated through prison gang intermediaries, though that relationship was real and documented. The cartel also operated its own distribution infrastructure in the city, placing its own people in positions along the supply chain from the border crossing through the city's wholesale and retail distribution networks. The San Antonio DEA's High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Task Force, which contributed to the 2026 lettuce seizure and to numerous earlier operations, was established specifically to address the concentration of cartel-linked trafficking activity that federal analysts identified in San Antonio and the surrounding region. HIDTA designations are not applied to cities as a matter of course. They require a formal assessment of the region's strategic importance to the national drug trade and a finding that the concentration of trafficking activity is significant enough to warrant the additional federal coordination and resources the designation provides. San Antonio has carried that designation for years, a formal acknowledgement that the city is not simply a city through which drugs occasionally pass, but a node in the national distribution network that the cartels maintaining their American supply chains actively depend upon. The methamphetamine moving through San Antonio in the contemporary period is not, in the main, the product of domestic manufacturing operations of the kind that dominated the American meth trade in the 1990s and early 2000s. The shift from domestic to cartel-produced methamphetamine is one of the most consequential structural changes in the American drug trade of the past 2 decades, and San Antonio sits at the center of it geographically. Mexican cartel laboratories, operating primarily in the state of Sinaloa and in other production regions in western Mexico, now produce the overwhelming majority of the methamphetamine consumed in the United States, shipping it north through the border-crossing corridors, in quantities that the domestic cook operations of the previous era could never have matched. The purity levels of cartel-produced methamphetamine are significantly higher than what domestic operations historically produced, and the price at the wholesale level is significantly lower, because cartel production benefits from industrial scale, from access to precursor chemicals procured through international supply chains, and from the logistical infrastructure of organizations that have been refining their smuggling methods across decades. A load of 555 kilograms hidden in lettuce is the downstream product of that industrial-scale production system, and San Antonio is where it was heading when agents opened the boxes. The 2021 Operation Alamo Fade case offers a more granular picture of how cartel-linked trafficking networks operated in San Antonio in the period immediately before the lettuce seizure. That investigation, led by the DEA with assistance from the United States Marshals Service, the IRS Criminal Investigations Division, Customs and Border Protection, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Bexar County Sheriff's Office, and the San Antonio Police Department, targeted a 22-defendant network operating across San Antonio, Del Rio, and Laredo. The investigation produced the seizure of approximately 24 kilograms of methamphetamine, 6 kilograms of heroin, 3 kilograms of cocaine, 4 firearms, and approximately $100,000 in cash, along with other assets attributable to the organization. The charges allege that defendants including Arteaga, Rodriguez, Brown, Chavarria, Oscar Oviedo, Joseph Guerrero, Vasquez Martinez, Justin Guerrero, Gonzalez, Robles Moreno, Palafos Barron, Lopez, and Albelardo Oviedo had conspired to distribute methamphetamine and cocaine across the South Texas corridor, with specific counts covering distribution activity between June 2019 and April 2021. Among the defendants facing the most serious exposure, Martinez, Robles, and Jose Garcia faced between 15 years and life upon conviction of conspiracy to possess a controlled substance with intent to distribute. The geographic triangle described by the Operation Alamo Fade defendants, San Antonio, Del Rio, and Laredo, is the triangle that defines the operational map of virtually every major trafficking organization that has moved product through South Texas in the contemporary period. Del Rio sits on the Rio Grande, approximately 150 miles west of San Antonio, at another significant border crossing point. Laredo sits at the I-35 corridor crossing. San Antonio sits at the apex of the triangle, the inland hub where product arriving through both crossing points converges before being distributed northward and eastward through the American interior. The three cities form a supply chain geometry that cartel planners and logistics coordinators understand precisely, and the organizations they build to move product through that triangle reflect that understanding in their structure and their personnel deployments. The case of Giselle Cabrera Rodriguez, a San Antonio woman sentenced in federal court to 50 months in prison for conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute 5 kilograms or more of cocaine, adds a dimension to this picture that the large-scale seizure cases do not fully illuminate. Rodriguez was not a cartel operative in any organizational sense. She was a local participant in a distribution network that traced its supply back to cartel sources, a link in the chain between the wholesale level where product arrived from Mexico and the retail level where it reached individual consumers in San Antonio. The $45,700 seized from her residence during the search warrant execution represented the proceeds of that participation. Her case is instructive not because it is exceptional, but because it is ordinary, the kind of case that federal prosecutors in San Antonio work alongside the headline-generating 500-kilogram seizures, the street-level consequence of the same supply networks that produced the lettuce boxes and the Operation Alamo Fade defendants. What the full range of these cases describes, taken together, is a supply chain of extraordinary depth and resilience, running from cartel production facilities in Mexico, through the Laredo corridor and into San Antonio's distribution networks, feeding from there into the retail drug economy that the Mexican-EMI, the Texas Syndicate, and HPL all depended on for their tax revenue and their direct trafficking income simultaneously. The prison gangs did not compete with the cartel supply chain. They were customers of it, and in some cases, service providers to it, offering the cartel organizations the local knowledge, the enforcement capacity, and the street-level distribution infrastructure that the cartels needed to convert wholesale product into retail revenue on the American side of the border. The cartel provided the product, the prison gang provided the network, the city absorbed both. The San Antonio Dia Hidta Task Force's engagement with a cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación distribution network in the period covered by this video illustrates how that collaboration worked at the operational level. Working with a confidential source and an undercover officer, task force agents infiltrated the CJang network and orchestrated a controlled delivery from the southwest border to the northeastern United States, seizing 100 kilograms of cocaine and arresting high-level traffickers in the process. The operation demonstrated something that law enforcement analysts had long understood, but that the public record rarely captures with this clarity. The cartel networks running through San Antonio were not local operations. They were segments of national distribution systems whose reach extended from the Mexican border to the northeastern cities, with San Antonio serving as a critical relay point along the way. A kilogram seized in San Antonio on its way north could have been destined for a retail market in Chicago or Atlanta or New York. The city was not the end point of the supply chain. It was a way station in it. The 555 kilograms found in the lettuce boxes in February 2026 represent the single largest methamphetamine seizure documented in this video, and they represent one moment in an ongoing flow that federal law enforcement has been attempting to intercept since Operation Marquis began accumulating its 300 arrests in 1999. The flow has not stopped. The methods have changed. The concealment has become more sophisticated. The quantities involved at the wholesale level have grown as cartel production has scaled. The corridor running from Laredo through San Antonio to the American interior has remained constant throughout, because the geography has not changed and because no enforcement action, however successful in its immediate outcome, has yet addressed the economic conditions on both sides of the border that make that corridor profitable enough to sustain the effort required to use it. Pineda Gallegos and Lopez Ruiz sat in federal custody as this video's research period closed. facing charges that carried a potential sentence of 10 years to life. The lettuce that had concealed their cargo was presumably disposed of. 998 packages of methamphetamine sat in a federal evidence facility somewhere in San Antonio, the physical residue of a supply chain that was, at that moment, already finding a different route, a different method, a different set of boxes, because the demand that made the delivery profitable had not disappeared when the agents opened the first head of lettuce and found what was inside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cartel supply chain running through San Antonio required more than logistics. It required money to move, and the men who moved the money built systems as sophisticated as anything the traffickers built around the product itself. One of those systems left a paper trail that reached from San Antonio all the way back to a cartel wanted on 2 continents. Section 8. The money behind the product. On a November morning in 2023, deportation officers from Immigration and Customs Enforcement's Enforcement and Removal Operations Division in San Antonio took custody of a 54-year-old man at the Don Hutto Residential Center outside of Taylor, Texas, where he had been held pending the outcome of immigration proceedings. His name was Oscar Arturo Arriola Marquez. An immigration judge had ordered his removal to Mexico on October 16th of that year. On November 1st, officers transported him to Laredo, crossed the bridge, and handed him to Mexican authorities waiting on the other side. The handoff was described in official documentation as occurring without incident. What the documentation also recorded was that Arriola Marquez had been, at various points in his criminal career, identified as the presumed leader of the Arriola Marquez cartel and listed among the world's most wanted fugitives. A federal indictment filed against him in the District of Colorado in December 2003 had charged him with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. He had been in the United States, living without lawful status, when ERO San Antonio received custody of him in August 2023, nearly 2 decades after that indictment was first filed. He was removed through Laredo. Mexican authorities took him. The case closed in the way that immigration removals close, without a trial, without a sentence, without any of the public accounting that a criminal prosecution would have produced. The Arriola Marquez removal sits at one end of a spectrum of money and power that runs through San Antonio's relationship with Mexican cartel organizations, a spectrum whose other end is occupied by the wholesale drug seizures and street-level distribution networks described in the previous section. Arriola Marquez was not a trafficker in the operational sense. He was a principal, the kind of figure who sits above the logistics of shipment and concealment and collection, whose value to an organization is not in his willingness to move product, but in his capacity to organize, fund, and direct the people who do. Organizations at this level require capital, and the movement of that capital through financial systems designed to detect exactly that kind of movement requires its own infrastructure, its own specialists, its own methods. The financial architecture of cartel operations touching San Antonio is in many ways more sophisticated than the smuggling methods, because the product can be hidden in lettuce and in hollowed-out hams, but money, once it exists in significant quantities, requires a more elaborate transformation before it can be used. The San Antonio Dia Hidda Task Force's investigation into what its reports described as a massive international drug cartel financial scheme offers one of the clearest available pictures of how that transformation worked in practice. The investigation began as a methamphetamine importation case, the standard entry point for South Texas cartel investigations, before expanding in scope to reveal the financial architecture sitting beneath the drug distribution operation. By the time the task force had mapped the full structure, they were looking at a scheme whose reach extended well beyond San Antonio, beyond Texas, and in some dimensions beyond the United States. The investigation resulted in what officials described as an international drug cartel financial scheme of significant scale, one that required the kind of multi-jurisdictional coordination that produces 17 agency task forces and years of accumulated financial intelligence before a single arrest warrant is signed. The mechanics of cartel money laundering as documented across San Antonio linked investigations follow patterns that financial intelligence analysts have described with reasonable consistency across multiple cases. Drug proceeds generated at the retail level in American cities arrive in cash. The cash is aggregated through a network of collection points, sometimes through businesses with high cash transaction volumes, sometimes through a network of individual money handlers, sometimes through the use of nominees who deposit funds in small enough increments to avoid triggering the federal reporting thresholds that apply to cash transactions above $10,000. The practice of structuring deposits to avoid those thresholds is itself a federal crime called structuring, and it appears in the financial charges attached to nearly every major San Antonio cartel prosecution. Once the cash is inside the financial system in some form, it begins moving through a series of transactions designed to put distance between the funds and their origin, a process that can involve wire transfers, real estate purchases, business investments, the purchase and resale of luxury goods, and any number of other mechanisms whose common feature is the creation of a paper trail that looks, on its surface, like legitimate commercial activity. The case of the San Antonio woman Giselle Cabrera Rodriguez, whose $45,700 was seized during a search warrant in connection with her cocaine distribution conviction, represents the retail end of this financial chain. The money sitting in that residence was pre-laundering, cash generated directly from drug sales that had not yet been processed through any mechanism designed to disguise its origin. At the wholesale level, where the quantities of cash generated by a single transaction are orders of magnitude larger, the sophistication of the laundering infrastructure required increases proportionately. A single successful wholesale delivery of the kind described in the previous section, 555 kilograms of methamphetamine, represents a cash value at wholesale prices that would require a serious financial operation to absorb without attracting immediate regulatory attention. The organizations that ran these operations in San Antonio built that financial infrastructure with the same deliberateness they applied to the logistics of concealment and transportation. The Gulf Cartel's financial operations touching San Antonio provide a specific documented example of how that infrastructure was assembled and maintained across years of activity. The investigation that produced the sentencing of Salvador Cortez Nava, a San Benito resident convicted of conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute over 5 kilograms of cocaine and sentenced to 120 months in federal prison, revealed a financial paper trail whose specificity is worth examining in detail. A series of drug and money seizures connected to Cortez Nava's activities documented the flow of cartel proceeds through South Texas across several years. In February 2016, authorities seized $501,145 in drug proceeds concealed inside a vehicle. In April 2017, they seized 1.1 kilograms of cocaine intended for distribution, followed by the discovery of an additional 48.35 kilograms belonging to the Gulf Cartel. In 2018, seizures totaled 29.45 kilograms of cocaine and $269,996 in cash. In 2019, 68.3 kilograms of cocaine and over $812,000 in cash were seized. By the time the investigation closed, authorities had seized over $1.5 million in proceeds and approximately 150 kilograms of cocaine. As part of his guilty plea, Cortez Nava agreed to forfeit several properties, a vehicle, 2 firearms, jewelry, watches, and other items. The court also heard evidence that he had ordered the kidnapping of a co-conspirator who had been responsible for the loss of a drug shipment and had threatened harm over missing loads. The Cortez Nava case illustrates the financial dimension of Gulf Cartel operations touching South Texas with unusual precision because the seizure record documents the cash flows at specific moments across a multi-year investigation. The total is over $1.5 million in seized proceeds from a single operator. That figure represents only what was intercepted. The portion that moves successfully through whatever laundering infrastructure Cortez Nava used before authorities caught up with the investigation is by definition unquantifiable, because successful money laundering leaves behind legitimate-looking assets rather than evidence of its origin. The properties forfeited as part of his guilty plea represent the portion of those proceeds that had been converted into real estate, a standard laundering vehicle whose use in cartel financial operations across South Texas has been documented across multiple investigations. Real estate converts cash into an asset that appreciates, generates legitimate rental income in some cases, and can be sold through normal commercial channels to produce clean proceeds. The problem, from the perspective of the person using it, is that real estate transactions leave a permanent and publicly accessible paper trail that financial investigators have learned to follow. The broader HIDTA investigation into the international drug cartel financial scheme that the San Antonio Task Force developed reflects a pattern seen across multiple jurisdictions where cartel financial infrastructure has been fully mapped. The scheme extended beyond the movement of drug proceeds and into the territory of commercial finance, using legitimate business structures to generate the appearance of lawful income against which drug proceeds could be offset. Craig Larrabee, the special agent in charge of Homeland Security investigations in San Antonio, described the investigation as revealing a large-scale operation that attempted to move millions in illicit funds and launder the proceeds. The HSI's description emphasized the financial investigation's unique contribution to the case, noting the agency's expertise in financial crimes as the specific tool that allowed the full scope of the scheme to be mapped. Drug enforcement agencies are designed to follow product. Financial investigators are designed to follow money. The combination, applied to an operation that was simultaneously moving narcotics and laundering the proceeds, required both skill sets operating in genuine coordination to produce a complete picture of the organization's activities. The father and son indicted in 2025 for providing material support to a Mexican cartel designated as a foreign terrorist organization represent the furthest extension of this financial logic in the San Antonio region's recent legal history. The two men allegedly operated a business called Arroyo Terminals in Rio Hondo, Texas, and were charged with conspiring to move millions in illicit crude oil and launder the proceeds from that activity. The indictment alleged that they had aided and abetted the fraudulent entry of approximately 2,881 shipments of oil in violation of the Tariff Act, and had conspired to conduct financial transactions designed to conceal and disguise the nature and source of the proceeds. The charges represented something the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Texas described as a new legal paradigm, charging not the traffickers and the trigger pullers directly employed by the cartels, but their confederates and enablers, people who put money in the cartel's pocket through commercial arrangements that were, on their surface, entirely legitimate. A business processing crude oil shipments across the border is not, on its face, a drug trafficking operation. It becomes one, in the legal sense, when the proceeds of those shipments are used to fund an organization designated as a foreign terrorist organization, and when the people running the business know what they are funding. The HSI special agent in charge in San Antonio framed the investigation in terms that captured the agency's specific approach to these cases. He described strong collaborations and relentless investigative work, exposing a possible large-scale operation that attempted to move millions in illicit crude oil and launder the proceeds, and emphasized HSI's unique authorities and expertise in financial investigations as the tools that made the case possible. The FBI special agent in charge in San Antonio added that eliminating foreign terrorist organizations by depriving them of their funding was a top priority, and that seizing their most valued assets was central to that mission. The framing reflects a shift in how federal law enforcement in San Antonio has approached the cartel financial problem over the past decade. A shift from treating money laundering as a secondary charge attached to a drug trafficking prosecution toward treating the financial infrastructure itself as the primary target, on the theory that an organization deprived of its ability to move, store, and deploy its proceeds is more fundamentally disrupted than an organization that merely loses a drug shipment. The Areola Marquez removal, the Cortez Nava sentencing, the Hidta financial scheme investigation, the Arroyo Terminals indictment, the $45,000 seized from Giselle Cabrera Rodriguez's residence, the $800,000 in cash seized alongside 68 kilograms of cocaine in a single 2019 Gulf cartel operation touching South Texas. These cases describe a financial ecosystem of significant depth and complexity operating in and through San Antonio across more than 2 decades. The ecosystem serves the same supply chain described in the previous section, transforming the cash generated by drug sales into assets and income streams that can sustain the organizations generating it across the years and the decades required to build and maintain the kind of criminal infrastructure documented across this video. The money is what makes everything else possible. The smuggling methods require investment. The distribution networks require payment. The enforcement apparatus requires funding. The lawyers required to defend arrested members require fees. The families of incarcerated members require support. All of it flows from the same source, from the retail drug transactions happening on San Antonio's streets, from the wholesale loads moving through the Laredo corridor, from the commercial arrangements that blur the line between legitimate business and cartel finance, until investigators spend years pulling the threads apart. The 555 kilograms in the lettuce boxes were worth a calculable sum at the wholesale level. That sum, had it successfully completed its journey through the distribution network and returned to its source as cash, would have entered exactly the kind of financial processing system described across this section. It would have been structured into bank deposits, converted into real estate, invested in businesses, wired through a succession of accounts across multiple jurisdictions, and eventually emerged as assets indistinguishable, on paper, from the proceeds of any legitimate commercial enterprise. The lettuce stopped it. The money behind the next load was already moving. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The financial infrastructure behind San Antonio's drug economy required the movement of millions across borders and through legitimate systems. But not every figure in this city's criminal history operated at that scale. Some built their power block by block, street by street, in neighborhoods where the choice between poverty and the gang economy was rarely presented as a choice at all. Section 9. The streets beneath the structure. On a January morning in 2007, FBI agents and San Antonio police fanned out across Bexar County, within hours of a federal grand jury returning a racketeering indictment that named 23 defendants, all of them described in charging documents as holding leadership positions within the Texas Mexican Mafia. Most were already in custody when the indictment was unsealed. The ones who were not were located and arrested the same day. The indictment alleged a pattern of racketeering activity connected to 22 killings across San Antonio, Austin, and Atascosa County, and it cleared more than 20 unsolved homicides that had sat in police files since the year 2000. The press conference that followed featured United States Attorney Johnny Sutton, who described intimidation, violence, and murder as standard operating procedure for the defendants, and stated that since 2004, his office had put over 130 members of the Mexican Mafia in federal prison. The arrests were executed cleanly. The defendants were processed. The indictment moved toward trial. And on the streets of San Antonio's west side and east side and south side, the neighborhoods those 23 defendants had operated in continued the next morning in exactly the same way they had operated the morning before, because the men who had just been removed from them were not the neighborhoods. They were one layer of management sitting above a street economy that generated its own momentum independently of who was running it at any given moment. Understanding San Antonio's organized crime history requires spending time at that street level, below the generals and the free world captains and the cartel financial architects, in the neighborhoods where the Mexicanemi's dime tax was collected, and HPL's cocaine moved through retail channels, and the Texas Syndicate soldiers maintained territorial discipline. The street economy of San Antonio's criminal underworld is not simply the lowest level of a hierarchy that is interesting only at the top. It is the engine of the entire structure. Every dollar that reached Heriberto Huerta's commissary account in Florence, Colorado, every peso that funded a Gulf cartel load through Laredo, every payment that sustained an incarcerated Texas syndicate member's family, originated in a transaction at the street level in San Antonio. The men and women at that level are, in most cases, the people least insulated from risk and least rewarded by the system they sustain. They are also the people most visible to law enforcement, most frequently arrested, most likely to accumulate the kind of criminal history that eventually produces the long sentences attached to federal recidivist enhancement provisions. The geography of San Antonio's street-level drug economy follows the city's own social geography, with a consistency that makes the map almost predictable to anyone who has studied both. The West Side, historically the heart of the city's Mexican-American working-class community, was Mexicanemi territory in the way that West French Place was Mexicanemi territory, not because any formal proclamation established it as such, but because the organization's founding membership drew heavily from those neighborhoods and the social networks that connected prison returnees to street-level operations ran through those communities with the density of long familiarity. The East Side carried its own distinct criminal geography, one that federal documents reference explicitly when describing Robert Hernandez's role as an East Side lieutenant operating under Raul Ramos's direction. The South Side and the areas extending toward the border corridor carried the heaviest concentration of cartel-linked distribution activity, reflecting their proximity to the I-35 corridor and the Laredo connection. These are not rigid lines. Territories overlap, shift, and are renegotiated through violence and treaty across years. But the underlying geography of the city's criminal economy reflects the underlying geography of its poverty and its demographics, and understanding one requires understanding the other. The role of street gangs in San Antonio's organized crime ecosystem is distinct from the role of the prison gangs that sit above them in the hierarchy, and the distinction matters for understanding how the system actually functioned at the level where most of its violence occurred. The Mexicanemi's constitution, read into the federal trial record across multiple prosecutions, makes explicit that the gang itself does not primarily operate at the retail level. Each rank-and-file member is permitted to operate up to 3 retail drug operations, but the mid-level and retail distribution of narcotics across San Antonio is dominated by street gangs and independent dealers, people who are not Mexicanemi members but who operate in Mexicanemi territory and therefore owe the dime. The prison gang is, in this sense, less a drug trafficking organization in the retail sense than it is a regulatory body imposing a tax on an existing retail market that it does not own or directly control. The street gangs and freelancers who actually move product at the retail level are the tax base. The Mexicanemi is the tax authority. The difference between those two positions is the difference between bearing the risk of the street and collecting a percentage of other people's risk from a position of enforced distance. The San Antonio Police Department's 1993 count of 1,262 drive-by shootings in a single year is the most compressed single-year illustration of what that street-level ecosystem looked like at its peak. That figure represents more than 3 drive-by shootings per day, every day, for an entire year, across a city whose population at the time was approaching 1 million people. The shootings were concentrated in specific neighborhoods, in the zones of contested territory where the boundaries between different gangs' operational areas were enforced through the kind of violence that produces casualty statistics. The 222 homicides recorded in the same year tell the same story in a different unit of measurement. Law enforcement officials who worked through that period described it as a city in which the gang economy had temporarily outgrown the enforcement capacity available to contain it, a situation in which the combination of the Mexicanemi's expanding tax collection operation, the competing territorial claims of street-level gangs, and the volume of narcotics flowing through the city from the Laredo corridor had produced a level of sustained violence that overwhelmed patrol resources and investigative capacity simultaneously. The cases that populated San Antonio's federal dockets across the years following that 1993 peak offer a granular picture of the individual lives that the street economy consumed. Edward Rodriguez, known as Trece, was one of 12 Texas Mexican Mafia members sentenced in January 2010 to prison terms of between 6 and 10 years for enforcing the gang's drug extortion tactics on San Antonio's streets. What the trial record noted about Rodriguez, almost as an aside, was that he had been discharged honorably from the United States Marine Corps in the 1970s before joining the gang. He said nothing at sentencing. He was one of 12 men who said nothing as the judge imposed sentence and ordered them not to associate with other gang members. The order against association is standard in federal gang sentencing, a formal acknowledgement by the court that the social network connecting these men is itself the instrument of their criminal activity. Rodriguez had served his country in uniform and then spent the subsequent decades enforcing a criminal tax on his city's drug dealers. The two facts about him sit in the court record without commentary, requiring none. Robert Garcia, known as Bo, received 10 years in that same January 2010 sentencing. Robert Hernandez, known as Gino, received 8 years and 3 months in the same proceeding, a different sentence from the 35 years he would receive a decade later after the Ramos prosecution targeted him again for his continued role as an East Side lieutenant. The fact that Hernandez appeared in the federal sentencing record in 2010 and again in 2019, having resumed his operational role in the organization after serving his first sentence, is the clearest possible illustration of the cycle that gang intelligence experts have described consistently across the history of San Antonio's prison gang prosecutions. A man serves a federal sentence, is released, returns to the same organization he was convicted for serving, resumes the same role or a similar one, and eventually appears in another federal indictment. The organization has not changed. The man has not changed. The sentence was an interruption, not a transformation. Richard Lopez, known as Kicker, received 7 years in the same proceeding. Ramiro Carrizales, known as Rudy C., was among those convicted. Ruben Quintero, known as Sapo, Amador Sanchez, known as Mayo, Tony Uribe, known as Negro, Daniel Aguilar, known as Ice, Luis Mireles. These are the names that populated the middle and lower levels of the organization's San Antonio hierarchy across a decade of prosecutions, men whose operational roles connected the general's instructions to the street-level collections, whose court cases collectively document the texture of the criminal economy they sustained. They are not famous names. They do not appear in the organized crime histories that focus on the dramatic and the singular. They are the infrastructure of the system, the load-bearing members without whom the generals have no organization to command. The 2008 investigation that preceded the January 2010 sentencing had been led jointly by the FBI and San Antonio Police and had produced the arrest of more than 30 members on racketeering charges. That investigation cleared more than 24 killings that had occurred between 2000 and 2005, homicides that had sat in the unsolved column of the San Antonio Police Department's case files for years before the federal investigation's wiretaps and confidential source reporting connected them to specific defendants. The cleared homicides represent something specific about how street-level gang violence is documented and prosecuted. A homicide committed in the context of an organization's internal discipline or territorial enforcement is not, typically, investigated in isolation. It is investigated as part of a pattern, and the pattern only becomes fully legible after years of accumulated intelligence work have produced a picture of the organization comprehensive enough to locate individual killings within it. 20 unsolved homicides become solvable, simultaneously, when a federal investigation maps the organization that committed them. That is why the big racketeering prosecutions consistently clear clusters of cold cases alongside their primary charges. The street geography of San Antonio's criminal economy extended well beyond the city limits, into the surrounding communities that federal indictments consistently named alongside the city itself. Hondo, 40 miles to the west; Floresville, 40 miles to the southeast; New Braunfels, 30 miles to the north; Uvalde, 80 miles to the west. These are small cities and towns whose criminal economies are, in the organizational sense, extensions of San Antonio's, connected to the city's prison gang networks through the same membership rolls, the same supply chains, and the same tax collection apparatus. The 38th Judicial District Attorney's Office in Hondo obtained more than 50 state indictments of Texas Mexican Mafia members and associates in the Hondo area alone in the period preceding the 2017 Ramos indictment. That number, 50 indictments in a single small city jurisdiction over a defined investigative period, reflects the depth of the Mexicanemi's penetration into the communities surrounding San Antonio, the degree to which the organization's territorial claims extended well beyond the city's own boundaries and into the rural and semi-rural landscape of south-central Texas. The women who appear in the federal case records of San Antonio's organized crime prosecutions occupy a specific and often overlooked position in this street-level ecosystem. Matilda Vallejo, 56 years old, was among the 8 defendants already in law enforcement custody when the 2004 DEA-led sweep of 26 ranking Mexicanemi members was announced. Sylvia Gill, 44, appeared in the same indictment. The Texas Syndicate's documents and internal communications referenced a female member alleged to have smuggled heroin to incarcerated Vice President Benito Alonso, her notebooks containing names and telephone numbers of TMM members seized during the execution of a federal search warrant at her San Antonio residence in August 2011. The Constitution of the Mexicanemi, with its explicit statement that the organization works in every criminal aspect imaginable, did not restrict membership or participation by gender, and the federal case records reflect a reality consistent with that constitutional silence. Women moved money, smuggled contraband into prisons, managed communications between incarcerated leaders and street-level operators, and in some cases held formal rank within the organizational hierarchy. The drive-by shooting count in San Antonio fell from 1,262 in 1993 to 212 by 1997 and 89 by 2001, a reduction that law enforcement officials attributed to a combination of factors, including increased federal coordination, gang intelligence investment, civil nuisance abatement laws that restricted suspected gang members from public association, and the cumulative effect of the successive federal prosecutions that removed leadership layers from the most active organizations. Those numbers tell a real story about a real reduction in the most visible form of gang violence in the city across that decade. They do not tell the full story. The homicide rate did not fall as sharply or as consistently. The drug trade did not slow. The dime tax did not stop being collected. The cartels did not stop using the Laredo corridor. What changed was the form of the violence more than its volume. A shift from the conspicuous drive-by shooting toward the more contained and deliberate targeted killing that is harder to count and harder to attribute and leaves fewer witnesses willing to talk. The 22 killings alleged in the 2008 federal indictment, cleared across San Antonio, Austin, and Atascosa County, had all occurred after the drive-by shooting count had fallen. They were not drive-bys. They were organized, targeted, and in many cases carefully planned killings, the kind of violence that a maturing criminal organization deploys when it has moved beyond the crude territorial marking of a street gang into the more deliberate enforcement and discipline operations of an established criminal enterprise. The Mexicanemi by 2000 was not the same organization it had been in 1993. It was more sophisticated, more careful, and in the specific sense of being harder to see and harder to prosecute, more dangerous. The street it operated on was the same street. The neighborhoods were the same neighborhoods. The people in those neighborhoods were the same people, living in the same relationship to poverty and to the criminal economy that poverty had made available to them since long before Heriberto Huerta picked up a pen in a Huntsville prison block in 1984 and began writing a constitution. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The streets that fed San Antonio's criminal economy produced the bodies and the convictions and the decades of federal prosecution documented across this video. The final section pulls the camera back from all of it, names the pattern underneath the cases, and takes one last look at what 4 decades of organized crime left behind in a city that keeps calling itself something else. Section 10. What the city left behind. Every year, 8 million tourists pass through San Antonio without knowing any of the names in this video. They walk the river walk, and photograph the Alamo, and eat on the outdoor terraces and board the tour barges, and leave with the version of the city that the city wants them to carry home. That version is not false. The limestone buildings are real. The military installations are real. The growth statistics are real. What is also real is the parallel record sitting in the Western District of Texas Federal Courthouse a few blocks from the tourist corridor. The filing cabinets of indictments and sentencing documents and racketeering trial transcripts that describe a different city operating beneath the one on the postcards. That record runs from the late 1960s to February 2026, and it has never stopped accumulating pages, and the men whose names fill those pages built something in San Antonio that 8 million tourists a year walk over without feeling it underfoot. The line connecting Carrasco to the lettuce boxes found in a San Antonio commercial space in February 2026 is not a straight one. It bends and fractures through decades of shifting gang structures, cartel alliances, federal prosecutions, and the deaths of men whose names appear across this video in court records and sentencing documents and execution reports. But it is a line, and following it reveals something true about San Antonio that the city's official self-presentation does not capture. The city is a node. It has been a node since before the Texas-Mexican Mafia existed, since before the Texas Syndicate was founded in a California prison by men who missed home, since before HPL split into the 45s and the 1612s and went to war with itself over which geography owned the organization's future. San Antonio is the place where the border corridor meets the interstate highway system, where the product coming north from Laredo meets the distribution networks reaching east toward Houston and north toward Dallas and beyond. That geography is not going to change. The city will always sit where it sits, and the smugglers will always understand what that means before the tourists do. What the full arc of San Antonio's organized crime history reveals, when you lay all 10 sections of it flat and read across them, is that the city never produced a single dominant criminal figure in the way that popular accounts of organized crime tend to require. There is no San Antonio equivalent of a figure who consolidated everything under a single name and held it there long enough to become a legend. Carrasco came closest, and he died in an 11-day prison siege of his own making at the age of 34. What San Antonio produced instead was something more durable and more difficult to address than any individual, a set of overlapping organizational structures, each with its own constitution and its own hierarchy and its own revenue model, occupying the same city simultaneously and negotiating the terms of their coexistence through violence and treaty and the kind of pragmatic commercial arrangement that puts ideology aside when profit is available on both sides of the table. Heriberto Huerta built the most architecturally sophisticated of those structures, and the measure of his achievement is not in his own freedom, which he has not had since 1993, but in the organization's continued operation across 3 decades of his incarceration. He sits in a supermax cell in Florence, Colorado, locked down for 23 hours a day, and the Texas-Mexican Mafia continues to collect the dime on San Antonio's streets, continues to place generals on the city's west side and east side and in the surrounding communities, continues to absorb the successive waves of federal prosecution that have produced, by the count available from the cases documented in this video, well over 200 federal convictions and scores of life sentences without closing. The Mexicanemy's Constitution, the document Huerta wrote himself in the early years of the organization, contains a statement of purpose so explicit that prosecutors have described it as proving a RICO enterprise on its face. The organization's founders wrote their own indictment into their founding document, and the organization survived it anyway. That is a specific kind of durability that demands respect, in the analytical sense, even when everything the organization does with that durability is worth condemning. Robert Perez rose through the ruins of Huerta's first conviction and built a general's career in San Antonio on a foundation of organized killing that federal prosecutors eventually connected to between 12 and 18 homicides across Bexar County and the surrounding area. He was executed in Huntsville on March 6, 2007, for the murders of Jose Travieso and Robert Rivas, killed on a San Antonio street on April 17, 1994, in a faction war that Perez entered voluntarily and prosecuted with a thoroughness that left bodies from the west side to Atascosa County. The 5 people bound with duct tape in the apartment on West French Place on August 8, 1997, died in the middle of a search for $300 and 5 pounds of marijuana. Their deaths cleared no territory and resolved no dispute and produced no tactical advantage for anyone. They were the collateral geometry of an organization that had made violence so routine that it no longer required a proportionate justification. Perez is gone. West French Place is still there. Raul Ramos ran the same organization's Free World General position in San Antonio from at least 2015 until his arrest in May 2017 and his sentencing to life in federal prison in October 2019, collecting the dime across 4 quadrants of the city and the surrounding rural communities through a hierarchy of lieutenants and captains whose methods court documents described with the flat precision of operational manuals. He was ordered to pay $275,500 in forfeiture. He was 54 years old at sentencing. The organization restructured around his absence before the ink dried on the judgment. A new general, named or unnamed in any public record available at the time this video was researched, moved into the position that Ramos had vacated, because the position exists independently of the person who holds it, because Huerta's constitution created a structure rather than a personality cult, and because the demand for the organization's services on San Antonio's streets has not diminished simply because one of the men managing those services is now in a federal cell. The Texas Syndicate's contribution to San Antonio's criminal history runs parallel to the Mexicanamis across the same decades, founded on the same principle of lifetime membership and non-negotiable obligation, enforcing the same 10% tax through the same escalating violence, maintaining the same coded communication channels between incarcerated leaders and street-level operators. Its founding rule, that the organization comes before family, produced exactly the internal violence that rule implies. Men were killed for violating the Constitution. Men were killed for talking. Men were killed because someone in a prison cell drew an X over their name in a letter, and a soldier on the outside understood what the symbol meant. The organization continues to operate, estimated at approximately 1,000 members in Texas prisons alone, with the same working relationships with the Gulf Cartel that gave it access to wholesale narcotics across the South Texas corridor throughout the period covered by this video. HPL built its San Antonio chapter on the fracture between the valley and the city, survived its own internal war, reunited in 1998, and continued moving cocaine and marijuana north from Nuevo Laredo through the Laredo corridor and into distribution networks that reached into San Antonio's retail drug economy alongside every other organization operating in the same space. The 2024 federal indictment named 24 defendants and described an organization whose income was explicitly directed, in part, toward sustaining members behind bars. The men named in that indictment, Jesus Mendoza Jr. and Gilberto Garcia and Ramon Lozoya and the others, were the 2024 iteration of a chapter that had existed in San Antonio since the late 1980s. The charges they faced carried sentences ranging to life. The organization they belonged to predated them and will outlast their prosecutions. The cartel supply chain that fed all of these organizations and that operated its own independent distribution infrastructure in the city alongside them moved through San Antonio in quantities that the individual cases only partially capture. Operation Marquis produced more than 300 arrests from a single cocaine trafficking investigation beginning in 1999. Operation Alamo Fade seized 24 kilograms of methamphetamine, 6 kilograms of heroin, 3 kilograms of cocaine, 4 firearms, and $100,000 in cash from a 22-defendant network in 2021. The Gulf Cartel's financial operations through South Texas produced over $1.5 million in seized proceeds and 150 kilograms of cocaine from the Cortez Nava investigation alone. The CJNG distribution network, infiltrated by the San Antonio HIDTA task force, yielded 100 kilograms of cocaine in a single controlled delivery. And on February 3, 2026, 998 packages of methamphetamine came out of boxes of fresh lettuce in a San Antonio commercial space, 555 kilograms in total, the largest single seizure documented in this video, representing one intercepted load in a flow whose unintercepted portion is, by definition, unknown. What San Antonio's law enforcement and prosecutorial record across 50 years demonstrates, with a consistency that cuts across every administration and every enforcement strategy, is that prosecution is a necessary tool and an insufficient one. The federal RICO prosecutions of the Mexicanemi produced more than 200 convictions and cleared scores of unsolved homicides and sent generals and captains and lieutenants and soldiers to federal cells across 28 states. The city is, by every available metric, safer than it was in 1993, when 1,262 drive-by shootings and 222 homicides defined the peak of the gang violence that the dime tax economy produced. The reduction is real. The organizations that produced those numbers are also real, and they are still operating. The dent is real. The structure it was made in remains intact. The men documented across this video lived, and in some cases died, inside a city whose geography made their business possible, and whose social conditions made their recruitment pool renewable. San Antonio sits at the junction of the border corridor and the national highway system. It has one of the highest poverty rates of any large American city. It has one of the largest concentrations of returning prison population in Texas. It has a criminal justice system that has sent hundreds of men to federal prison over the past 3 decades and received them back at regular intervals, each one already integrated into the organizational structure they had entered before their first conviction. The Texas prison system, which was supposed to contain the Texas Mexican Mafia and the Texas Syndicate and HPL, has functioned across the history documented in this video as the primary recruitment, training, and command infrastructure for all 3 of them simultaneously. Men enter the system as prospects and emerge as members. They enter as soldiers and emerge as lieutenants. The institution designed to interrupt the cycle has been the cycle's most reliable engine. The commissary account in Florence, Colorado, that investigators found containing $13,000 belonging to Heriberto Huerta is the image that stays. A man locked in a cell for 23 hours a day in the most secure prison in the United States, unable to make a phone call without it being recorded and reviewed, unable to send a letter without it being read, unable to see another human being, except for the hour permitted each weekday in a fenced outdoor space the size of a bathroom. $13,000 in his commissary account, money that had been collected on the streets of San Antonio by men he had never met, passed through layers of the organization he had designed in a Huntsville prison block in 1984, and deposited into an account belonging to a man the federal government had done everything in its institutional power to isolate from the world he built. It got there anyway. That is San Antonio's organized crime history in a single fact. The city kept paying. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.